The sea gave him up like something it couldn't digest. 3 fishermen working the dawn nets off. White Harbor's outer breakwater saw it first, a shape beneath. The gray chop that was too large for driftwood, too rigid for a drowned man, catching the pale morning light in ways that stone and timber simply did not. It moved with the current, but not helplessly, one arm extended, cutting toward the shallows with the last mechanical instinct of something that refused to stop functioning, even when everything else had. By the time it scraped bottom on the rocky shelf, below the new castle's eastern wall, word had already traveled up through the harbor district in that particular way that bad news always traveled in port cities, faster than it should, louder than anyone intended. Lord Wyman Manderley, largest man in the north and considerably more dangerous than his considerable girth suggested, was eating his second breakfast when his steward arrived pale-faced and breathing hard. The steward had seen pirates. He had seen ironborn reavers. He had seen a kraken's arm pulled up in a cod net once, thick as a man's torso and still weakly grasping. He did not have words for what was lying in the shallows below the new castle, and Lord Manderley read that absence of words with the practiced political intelligence of a man who had survived in the north by being precisely as shrewd as he appeared to be fat. He went himself. He brought 40 men at arms and his 2 granddaughters back inside the walls. Before he did, what Wyman Manderley found on the rocks below White Harbor was a giant in green-gray iron, faceplate sealed, utterly motionless. One gauntlet fist still closed around a weapon unlike anything in any maester's bestiaries or any merchant's cargo manifest. The armor was seamless in ways that made his master armorer physically uncomfortable. No visible rivets, no leather backing, plates that seemed to flow into one another like frozen water. The faceplate caught the morning light and threw it back cold and flat. There were dents in the chest plate and scoring along the left pauldron that spoke of violence on a scale that Wyman Manderley, who had seen the scars that Valyrian steel left on lesser metal, could not immediately account for. He stood 10 feet away for a long moment, 40 spears at his back, and considered the politics of the situation with admirable speed. If it was dead, it was worth something to a maester, to a collector of curiosities, potentially to Tyrion Lannister, who paid well for things that didn't fit the world's expected dimensions. If it was alive, it was worth considerably more and considerably more dangerous. If it was a weapon sent by one of the 5 kings currently bleeding Westeros dry, Lord Manderley needed to know which one before he made a single move. Because his son Wendell was a hostage of the Lannisters, and his loyalty was a performance he was maintaining at extraordinary personal cost. The faceplate moved. Not much. A slight tilt. The helmet orienting upward with the mechanical smoothness of something that had more in common with a Carthene automaton than a man in a suit of plate. The weapon in its fist shifted, and 40 spearmen took a collective step backward that Lord Manderley would not record in any official account of the morning. Then the giant sat up. It took stock of its surroundings with a thoroughness that Wyman Manderley would later describe to Robb Stark as the most unsettling thing he had ever witnessed. And he had witnessed Roose Bolton smile. The helmet turned slowly, cataloging the harbor, the castle walls, the fishing boats, the armed men, the gray northern sky. No panic, no confusion that expressed itself in any visible way. Just assessment, the way a master strategist surveys a battlefield before committing. A single soldier. When it spoke, the voice that came from behind that faceplate was low and flat and carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been through something that would have killed anyone else and was still working out the damage. Where am I? Lord Manderley, to his eternal credit, answered honestly. White Harbor, in the north, in the kingdom of Westeros. He paused. You're not from here. The helmet tilted again, fractionally. No. His name, extracted over the following hour through a conversation that Lord Manderley conducted in his great hall with the man still fully armored, and the 40 spearmen still very much present, was John. He offered no house name, no sworn lord, no banner. He said he was a soldier. When pressed on the nature of the armor, he said it was standard issue. When the master armorer attempted to examine the joint between gorget and pauldron, the man called John moved the armorer's hand away with a gentleness that made clear the gentleness was a choice and not a limitation. The weapon, the long firearm that none of Manderley's men could identify, he set on the table between them when asked, which surprised everyone. He wasn't surrendering it. He was demonstrating that he wasn't afraid of them taking it. There was a difference, and every man in the room understood it without being able to articulate why. "You came from the sea," Manderley said. "I came through something. The sea was where I ended up." John's voice carried no particular emotion about this. The flat effect of a man who had long since learned that panic was a resource, expenditure with negative returns. There was light, then water. "I've been in worse." The maester, old Theomore, suspicious of everything that didn't appear in a scroll, leaned forward. "The armor. How does it?" "It works," John said, in a tone that closed the subject. What Lord Manderley was processing, beneath the extraordinary surface circumstances, was the strategic reality. Robb Stark was fighting a war on 3 fronts. The Lannisters had his son. The Iron Throne's stability was a fiction, currently being maintained at the cost of several thousand northern lives. And here, washed up on his rocks like a gift from gods he wasn't sure he believed in, was something in armor that no one in Westeros could make, carrying a weapon no one in Westeros could match, who had survived whatever had brought him here and was sitting in his hall eating salted beef with the contained patience of someone waiting for the situation to clarify. Wyman Manderley was a careful man. He sent 2 ravens before midday, one to Robb Stark at Riverrun, one to his own private correspondent in King's Landing. Because in the War of the 5 Kings, information about the unexpected was the most valuable currency that existed, and Lord Manderley intended to spend it wisely. The chief spent 4 days in White Harbor, and he spent them the way he spent every unfamiliar operational environment, gathering intelligence, mapping terrain, and resisting the urge to act before he understood the situation. Cortana was gone. That absence sat in the back of his awareness like a wound that hadn't finished declaring itself. She had been mid-sentence when the slip-space rupture hit, something sharp and analytical about Covenant beacon frequencies, and then there had been light and cold, water and silence where her voice had lived in his helmet for years. The HUD still functioned. The armor still functioned. The MA-5B had 31 rounds remaining, and he wasn't going to waste a single one until he understood what he was shooting at and why. What he learned in 4 days. There were multiple factions fighting for control of a medieval feudal system. There was a king on a throne in the South who was universally described as either incompetent or cruel, depending on who was speaking. There was a northern rebellion, led by a young commander named Robb Stark who held the loyalty of the region he'd landed in. There were other claimants, names that the soldiers muttered with varying degrees of contempt or respect. And there was something beyond the northern ice wall that made hardened soldiers look away when they mentioned it, in the specific manner of men who had seen something they hadn't yet processed and weren't sure they wanted to. That last part interested him most. He'd spent his career fighting things that made hardened soldiers look away. He recognized the expression. On the 5th day, Robb Stark rode into White Harbor with 300 riders, and the chief stood in the courtyard and watched the young wolf dismount and take stock of him with the gray eyes of someone who had been raised to judge men quickly. Because in the North, slow judgment got people killed. Robb Stark was younger than expected, probably 19. He carried himself older. The way command aged people when the command was real and the consequences were measured in lives. His dire wolf, Gray Wind, enormous, the color of winter fog, stopped beside him and regarded the chief with the particular attention of an animal that was smarter than most of the men in the courtyard. The wolf didn't growl. It simply watched. Robb studied the armor for a moment, then looked up at the faceplate. "Lord Manderley says you're a soldier." "Yes." "Whose?" The chief considered how to answer that in terms that would translate. "My own now. My chain of command is gone." Robb Stark understood that. The chief could see it in the slight shift of his jaw, the recognition of a man operating without reinforcement in a war that had already taken things from him that weren't coming back. "You're not Lannister." "No. Not Baratheon. Not Greyjoy." The young wolf was working through it systematically, which spoke well of him. "You're not from Westeros at all, are you?" "No." A silence. Gray wind sat down, which seemed to mean something to the men around Rob, though the chief didn't know what yet. Can you fight? Rob asked. It was, the chief reflected, probably the most efficient question anyone had asked him since he arrived. He appreciated it. Yes, he said. Better than my best man? Probably. Rob Stark almost smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that had forgotten how to be young. Then we have things to discuss. But first, he gestured toward the great hall. You eat with us. In the north, that means something. The chief didn't know yet what guest right was, or what its violation would cost the young wolf before the year was out. He filed the gesture under Alliance building, accepted it, and followed Rob Stark inside, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the courtyard stone, his rifle at his back, 31 rounds between him and whatever this world intended to throw at him next. Behind him, Lord Manderley watched the second raven he'd sent fly back into his memory and felt, not for the first time, that the War of the Five Kings had just become considerably more complicated. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Rob Stark had learned to read men the way his father had taught him, not by what they said, but by what they didn't say, and not by how they moved when they were comfortable, but by how they moved when they thought no one was watching. The man called John didn't move like anyone Rob had ever seen. It wasn't the armor, though the armor was extraordinary in ways that made Rob's master armorer excuse himself from dinner, twice to compose himself. It was the quality of stillness inside the armor, the way John occupied space, with the absolute economy of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was a liability. He sat at Manderley's table and ate what was placed in front of him, with the methodical efficiency of a man fueling a machine, not enjoying a meal. He tracked every person who entered the room without appearing to turn his head. When one of Manderley's household guards shifted his spear grip near the door, John's hand moved 2 inches toward the weapon laid beside his trencher before stopping. A reflex corrected mid-expression, the unconscious response of someone whose reflexes had been built for environments where that half-second was the difference between living and not. Rob cataloged all of this over salted fish and dark bread and said nothing about it. What he said, instead, was, "Tell me about where you come from." John was quiet for a moment, not evasive, processing, selecting the pause of someone accustomed to operational security, choosing what could be shared without compromising something. Far away, he said finally, different enough that most of what I'd tell you wouldn't make sense in terms you have available. Try. Another pause. There's a war, larger than anything you're currently fighting. The enemy isn't after a throne. They want everything gone. Every living thing. He said it the way soldiers said things they'd stopped being surprised by. I've been fighting it for a long time. Rob looked at him steadily. Theon Greyjoy, sitting 2 seats down, made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a nervous clearing of the throat. Rob didn't look at Theon. And you ended up here through something I don't fully understand yet. I'm working on it. Working on getting back? John considered that with an honesty that Rob found unexpectedly striking. Working on understanding where I am first. Going back isn't useful if I don't know what I'm going back to. It was, Rob thought, the answer of a strategist rather than a lost man. There was a difference, and it mattered. Lord Manderley leaned forward over his considerable belly, rings glittering in the torchlight. The armor. I've had 3 men try to explain to me how it functions, and all 3 gave up. My maester believes it's sorcery. It's not sorcery, John said. It's engineering. The distinction may be academic in the north, Manderley replied pleasantly. He had the manner of a man who'd survived decades of Westerosi politics by being consistently underestimated. And Rob had noticed that John had noticed this about him within the first hour. They'd been watching each other with the mutual respect of people who recognized a particular kind of intelligence. Across the table. The weapon, Rob said. I've had men describe it. They say it makes thunder. It projects a metal slug at high velocity. Kills at range. Penetrates most materials. John paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality. I have limited ammunition. When it's gone, it's gone. I'm aware of that. The candor surprised the room. Rob could feel it, the subtle shift of men recalibrating. because warriors didn't typically announce their limitations. At a table full of strangers, it was either profound stupidity or profound confidence. And nothing about John suggested stupidity. You're telling us your weapon has limits, Rob said slowly, so that we don't build a strategy around something that will run out. John looked at him. The faceplate was still sealed. He hadn't removed the helmet, and no one had pushed the point. But somehow the attention behind it was readable anyway. Yes. Rob sat back. Gray wind had settled under the table near his feet, a warm weight against his boot, and was regarding John with the same focused, unbothered interest he reserved for things he'd decided weren't threats. The dire wolf had been wrong before, but rarely about people. They talked until the candles burned. Low and Manderley's servants began, making the particular sounds of a household that wanted to sleep but wouldn't say so to a king. Rob learned, piece by piece, what John was willing to offer. A soldier of extraordinary training and physical capability. Armor that had deflected things. John described in terms that Rob couldn't fully follow, but that sounded considerably worse than crossbow bolts. Experience fighting enemies that coordinated on a scale that dwarfed any Westerosi army. No political allegiance. No interest in the Iron Throne. No desire for land or gold. What do you want? Rob asked near the end. John was quiet for long enough that the question seemed to hang in the cooling air of the hall. To understand what's happening here. To be useful while I figure out how to get back. And another pause. This one with something heavier in it. There's something north of your wall that your men don't want to talk about. I want to know what it is. Every man at the table went still in the particular way. Northerners went still when the wall was mentioned after dark. What makes you ask about that? Rob said carefully. Because every time someone mentions it, they look like men who've seen something they're still processing. I know that look. The things that make soldiers look like that are usually the things that matter most. Rob studied him, thought about his father, who was dead now in King's Landing's political machinery, thought about John, his bastard brother, who had gone to the wall and sent back ravens. That had started professionally, formal, and grown progressively more urgent. Thought about Bran's dreams, which Maester Luwin had documented, with careful skepticism, and Rob had read, with the growing unease of a man who trusted the North's instincts more than the Citadel's dismissals. There are things beyond the wall, Rob said finally. Dead things. Men who've seen them say they move and they don't stop, and regular steel doesn't slow them. John absorbed this without visible reaction. How long has this been building? Years. Longer than most people in the South believe. Rob leaned forward. My brother is at the wall. His name is Jon Snow. He's seen them. I'd like to speak with him. I'd like that too, Rob said. But first I need to understand what you are to me, because right now, word of you is traveling south faster than my ravens can fly. And every lord with a spy in White Harbor is going to be asking that question. Tywin Lannister will be asking it within a fortnight. The political reality of Master Chief's existence in the War of the Five Kings was this. He was an unknown variable in a conflict where unknown variables were either weaponized or eliminated within weeks of appearing. Robb Stark understood this with the clarity that had made him, at 19, into something. The songs were already calling the young wolf. The North had rallied to him. The Riverlands had risen. But the Lannisters held King's Landing, held the wealth of Casterly Rock, held Robb's own bannermen's children as hostages in a dozen strategic arrangements, and held, through Joffrey's crown, the political legitimacy that the rest of Westeros still largely recognized whether it wanted to or not. A man in impossible armor with a weapon that made thunder was either the thing that broke that equation or the thing that shattered it in the wrong direction. Robb made his decision in the private way he made all his decisions, quickly, without visible deliberation. After the deliberation had already happened somewhere behind his gray eyes, he spoke to Jon alone in Manderley's Solar, with gray wind at his side and the door closed. I'm not going to try to command you, he said. I don't think that would work, and I'm not interested in testing it. But I need to know whose side you're on. Jon stood with his hands at his sides, the armor's bulk filling the small room in a way that should have felt threatening, and somehow didn't. I'm not on anyone's side yet. I'm trying to determine what's worth fighting for. That's honest. I've found it's more efficient than the alternative. Robb looked at him steadily. The Lannisters killed my father. They're holding my men's families. They put a boy on the throne who has his grandfather's cruelty and none of his intelligence. I'm fighting because the North doesn't forget and it doesn't yield. He paused. I'm also fighting a war I'm not sure I can win against an enemy with more gold, more men, and more political machinery than I have. And there's something north of the wall that will make every bit of it irrelevant if no one addresses it. John was quiet. I'm not asking you to kneel, Robb said. My father bent the knee to good men, and it cost him his head. I've learned from that. He extended his hand, not a lord's gesture. Something more direct than that. I'm asking if we're pointed in the same direction. John looked at the extended hand for a moment. Then he took it, the gauntlet enormous around Robb's fingers. The grip precise and controlled. North, John said. We're both pointed north. Gray Wind exhaled a long breath and laid his massive head on his forepaws, apparently satisfied that the negotiation had concluded sensibly. It had. For now. What neither man in that Solar could see was the Raven, already winging south from White Harbor, carrying Lord Manderley's carefully worded intelligence to a correspondent in King's Landing who would carry it, in turn, to a man with a preference for comfortable chairs and impeccable information. And that man would carry it, with his characteristic economy, to the most dangerous strategic mind currently resident in the Red Keep. Tywin Lannister read the report twice, set it down, picked it up again. Then he called for his maester and began drafting instructions for 3 separate agents in the north. Because in the Game of Thrones, you did not wait for unknown variables to declare themselves. You moved first, you moved quietly, and you made certain that by the time the variable understood the board, you already owned the pieces around it. Outside, King's Landing's evening bells rang the hour into the smoke-heavy air, indifferent to the cold intelligence being assembled in Casterly Rock's shadow, indifferent to the young wolf's new alliance in the north, indifferent to everything that was coming from beyond the wall, like a tide that didn't care about thrones, or gold, or the complicated loyalties of men who thought politics was the most dangerous game being played in their world. It wasn't. It was just the loudest one. The Raven reached King's Landing in 9 days. Varys read the copy, because Varys always read the copy, the original being a courtesy extended to whoever believed they were the intended recipient. In the quiet of his chambers beneath the Red Keep, where the stones were old enough to remember the Targaryen dragons and the air tasted permanently of torch smoke and careful secrets, he read it twice, as Tywin had done, though for entirely different reasons. Tywin had read it twice because he was assessing threat. Varys read it twice because he was assessing possibility, which was a different calculation entirely and one that Varys had always found more interesting. A man in seamless armor, a weapon that made thunder and killed at distance, washed ashore at White Harbor, currently in conversation with Robb Stark. Varys set the parchment down on his writing desk and pressed his soft fingers together in the gesture that meant he was doing something that looked like nothing. Littlefinger found him there an hour later, which was not a coincidence, because nothing Littlefinger did was a coincidence, and Varys had long since stopped pretending otherwise. You've heard, Littlefinger said, settling into the chair across the desk, with the comfort of a man who made every room his own within 30 seconds of entering it. I hear most things, Varys said pleasantly. Then you know what's sitting in Manderley's keep wearing armor that no smith in Westeros can account for. Littlefinger smiled the particular smile that never quite reached whatever passed for his inner life. Interesting timing. The young wolf needs a miracle. Perhaps the gods have developed a sense of drama. Or perhaps, Varys said, someone is about to make a very expensive mistake by underestimating what they don't understand. Littlefinger's smile didn't waver. Tywin's already sent men north. Tywin sends men everywhere. It's his most consistent quality. 3 teams. 1 to assess, 1 to recruit, 1 to discourage. Littlefinger examined his own fingernails with the theatrical casualness of a man performing disinterest for an audience of 1. He doesn't know which he'll need yet. He's being thorough. Varys considered the candle flame nearest him for a moment, the light moving across his smooth features without illuminating anything behind them. And what are you sending? Information, Littlefinger said. I'm sending information. South from the north and north from the south, and letting the current carry. Everything interesting, to where it's most useful. He stood, adjusting his doublet. The most dangerous piece on the board right now isn't the armored giant in White Harbor, Varys. It's whoever gets to him first and makes him understand the rules of the game. Perhaps, Varys said, as Littlefinger reached the door. He already understands the rules. Perhaps he simply doesn't find them worth playing. Littlefinger paused at the threshold. Everyone plays. They just don't all know it yet. He left. The candle flames steadied in his absence, burning clean and straight. And Varys sat alone with the intelligence from the north and the particular quality of stillness that preceded very careful action. In Harrenhal, that vast, dragon-melted monument to the cost of defying Targaryens, Tywin Lannister held his war councils in a hall where the stone walls had been fused by dragon fire into shapes that no mason could have made, rippled and grotesque, a permanent reminder of what happened to those who believed their walls were sufficient. He liked Harrenhal for precisely this reason. It focused the mind on consequences. His agent's first report reached him 2 days after he'd dispatched them. It told him what John 117 looked like, what he'd said to Manderley, and, crucially, that Robb Stark had ridden to White Harbor personally and spent an evening in conversation with the stranger. Before riding back to his war, Tywin read this without expression, which was his expression. The armor, he said to his maester. Nothing comparable in any record? None, my lord. Qohor has Valyrian techniques for. Qohor makes Valyrian steel. This isn't Valyrian steel. Tywin set the report down with the precise movements of a man who treated every physical action as an extension of his thinking. The weapon. Range, you said. The witnesses describe it killing at distances beyond any crossbow. My lord. Accurate. Loud. The bolts. If they are bolts, punched through shield and armor alike. Tywin was quiet for a moment. In the silence, the great hall's torches threw the melted walls into relief, shadows pooling in the dragon-shaped deformities of the stone. Limited ammunition, he said. It wasn't a question. His agents had been thorough about what John had said to Robb's table. He told them openly that the weapon has limits, which means he's either foolish or confident that the limitation doesn't matter, as much as we hope it does. Or honest, said a voice from the doorway. Tyrion Lannister entered his father's war council with the rolling gait that made him look perpetually about to trip and never quite managed it. He had a cup of wine in one hand and the expression of a man who had been eavesdropping for long enough to have useful opinions. Tywin regarded him with the particular look he reserved for things that were simultaneously useful and irritating. You weren't invited? Tywin said. I rarely am. I come anyway. You find this annoying but consistently tolerable because my observations are sound. Tyrion settled onto a bench, gesturing with his cup, a soldier who announces his weapons limitations to a table full of strangers isn't being foolish and isn't being naive. He's establishing a basis for honest dealing. He's saying, I won't lie to you about what I am, so don't expect to be deceived. That's a very specific kind of professional ethics. He paused. It's also completely alien to every military relationship in Westeros, which means he has no idea how dangerous that transparency is here. Tywin looked at his youngest son with the expression that meant he'd thought of this already but was revising the weight he'd assigned it. Or it means he doesn't care about the danger. Which is worse, Tyrion agreed cheerfully. Men who don't care about danger in the way that other men care about danger are either suicidal or so far past the normal scale of threat that our threats don't register properly. He sipped his wine. From what the reports say about the armor, deflecting crossbow bolts the way a man might brush off rain. I'd guess the latter. The Lannister agent reached White Harbor 11 days after the Raven. He was a careful man named Rolfe. Middling height, forgettable face. The kind of competent professional that Tywin Lannister maintained in every major port city in Westeros. Because information was the foundation of every strategy, and foundations required constant maintenance. Rolfe had instructions in 3 sealed pouches. The first pouch, assess, he'd already completed through observation from a harborside inn. The second pouch, recruit, he opened in his room by candlelight and read twice before committing it to memory and burning it. The offer was straightforward, in the way that Lannister offers were always straightforward. A place of honor in the most powerful military force in Westeros. Resources beyond anything the North could provide. Access to the citadels. Knowledge for questions about armor and engineering that no Northern Maester could answer. And the detail Tywin had added himself. Because he understood leverage. Passage to anywhere in the known world that a Lannister fleet could reach. Should the man called Jon wish to find his way home. Rolfe arranged a meeting through Manderley's harbormaster, who was Lannister adjacent in his financial loyalties, citing a merchant's interest in discussing unusual salvage. Jon arrived at the inn alone and sat across from Rolfe with the stillness that everyone who'd encountered him described, and that was somehow more unnerving in a small room than it had been in Manderley's great hall. Rolfe delivered the offer professionally and completely. Because Tywin Lannister's agents were thorough, Jon listened without interrupting, which Rolfe had been trained to read as a positive sign. Men who interrupted offers were reacting emotionally, and emotional reactions could be worked with. Silence was either consideration or absolute disinterest, and the difference was what Rolfe was paid to determine. The Lannisters, Jon said when Rolfe finished. Tell me about them. Rolfe had a prepared answer. He delivered it. The wealth, the military reach, the political legitimacy of the throne, the pragmatic stability that a Lannister supported, crown provided to Westeros after years of Targaryen instability. Jon listened to all of it. And the man who's in charge, Tywin Lannister. Tell me about him. Rolfe gave a second prepared answer, professionally positive. He orchestrated the Red Wedding, Jon said. Rolfe stopped. The use of the term, the Red Wedding, was wrong by several months. Because it hadn't happened yet. What Jon had said made no immediate sense. And Rolfe's training was good enough that he showed nothing on his face, while his mind recalibrated rapidly. I don't know what you're referring to, Rolfe said carefully. I've been talking to Northerners for 2 weeks, Jon said. They talk about Robb Stark's alliance with the Tullus. They talk about the feast at the Twins. They talk about the phrase. A pause. The way they talk about it, the way soldiers talk about something they're afraid is coming but haven't set out loud yet, tells me there's a plan already in motion that ends in a hall with guest right violated and a king dead. Another pause, flat and precise as a blade laid on a table. I've studied enough military history to recognize the shape of a strategic betrayal when the pieces are being positioned. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, the harbor district made its ordinary evening sounds, rope and timber and the slap of water against stone. Tywin Lannister is the most capable commander in Westeros. Jon continued, his voice carrying no particular judgment, just assessment. He wins. He's winning right now. But the way he wins, the tools he's willing to use, means that whatever stability his victory produces is built on a foundation that won't hold. Foundations built on violated trust collapse. He stood. Tell him I said no. Tell him I understand why he made the offer and that I don't hold it against him. Professionally, tell him, the briefest pause, that the thing coming from beyond the wall doesn't care who holds the Iron Throne, and that the most capable commander in Westeros is currently pointing his capabilities in exactly the wrong direction. Rolfe sat alone in the inn room for a long time after Jon left. The third sealed pouch, discourage, sitting unopened on the table in front of him. He thought about what discourage meant in practical Lannister terms. And he thought about the armor and the weapon and the quality of stillness in the man who wore them. He left White Harbor the next morning without opening the third pouch. Some instructions, Rolfe had survived long enough to know, were written for situations that the writer had understood correctly. This wasn't one of those situations. He rode south with the message Jon had given him, and with the private certainty that Tywin Lannister, who was rarely wrong about anything, had made a miscalculation in the north. That was going to be very interesting to watch from a safe distance. The wall was older than the kingdoms it protected. That was the thing Southerners never quite grasped. Lords and merchants, and maesters who knew the walls, height in feet and its length in miles, and its age in centuries, but understood none of those numbers in the way that mattered. They knew the wall the way you knew a number on a page. The men who lived under its shadow knew it the way you knew a thing that had been watching you your entire life and had Watched your father and his father before him, patient and vast and utterly indifferent to the political arrangements of the small worm creatures clustered at its base. Master Chief saw it from 3 miles out and felt something shift in his tactical assessment of the entire situation. He'd seen large structures. He'd walked the interior of Forerunner installations that made Westerosi castles look like field fortifications. He'd fought in environments where the scale of human engineering was so far exceeded by alien construction that the human mind defaulted to a kind of operational numbness just to keep functioning. He'd stood on the hull of a UNSC cruiser in vacuum and looked at the curvature of a planet below him and felt nothing in particular, because feeling things about scale was a luxury that combat didn't extend. The wall was different. It wasn't the height, though the height was extraordinary, 700 feet of ancient ice, blue-white in the early morning light, catching the pale northern sun and throwing it back transformed into something colder and stranger than ordinary light. It wasn't the length, stretching east and west until it vanished into the gray horizon like the edge of something absolute. It was the age of it, the sense of weight. That had nothing to do with the ice's physical mass and everything to do with what had been poured into its construction, not just labor and time, but intention, the specific intention of people who had seen something so terrible that they decided to build something this permanent rather than risk ever seeing it again. He knew that decision-making framework. He'd seen it expressed in different materials across multiple civilizations. It always meant the same thing. Whatever they'd been trying to keep out had been real, and it had been worse than anything they'd been willing to describe plainly. He rode through Castle Black's gate on a horse that had spent 2 weeks developing a resigned relationship with the weight of his armor and the way everything around it behaved slightly wrong. The yard was frost-hardened ground and gray stone, the crows moving through it in the perpetual state of disciplined grimness that characterized men who'd taken a vow with their eyes open and were living with what the vow actually meant in practice. They stopped when they saw him, not in fear, in the particular arrested motion of men who'd learned to assess threats quickly and were recalibrating, because nothing in their assessment framework covered this. Hands moved toward weapons that didn't move further. Eyes tracked the armor, the rifle across his back, the sheer physical scale of him in a way that was more professional than panicked. Then a voice from across the yard, quiet and carrying. Lord Commander, something's come through the gate. Jeor Mormont was 63 years old and had commanded the Knights Watch for over a decade, which meant he had outlasted every comfortable assumption about what the job entailed and arrived at a stripped-down relationship with reality that most men never achieved. He'd sent ravens south, warning of White Walkers, and received polite skepticism, wrapped in formal acknowledgement. He'd watched the Watch's numbers dwindle as Southern lords sent fewer criminals and more bodies to fill quotas on paper. He'd stood on the wall's top and looked north at something that made the cold feel deliberate rather than climatic. And he'd kept sending ravens and kept commanding and kept believing that the realm would eventually listen, because the alternative was despair, and despair was a resource expenditure with negative returns. He received Jon and his solar with the same expression he used for everything: measuring, weathered, precise. Jon Snow stood at the Lord Commander's right hand, and the chief noted him immediately, not because of the stark features that Robb's men had described, but because of the quality of attention he brought to the room. Jon Snow watched the chief the way the chief watched things, cataloging, assessing, reserving judgment until the assessment was complete. He was young, probably 17 or 18, with the kind of quietness that came from having learned early that loud opinions were a form of vulnerability. Ghost, the dire wolf, white as the wall itself, sat beside Jon's boot and watched the chief, with red eyes that contained an intelligence that the chief noted and filed without fully categorizing. Robb Stark sent a raven, Mormont said, without preamble. Said I should expect you. Said you asked specifically about what's north of the wall. Yes. Why? The chief considered the question with the straightforwardness that had apparently already alarmed a Lannister agent into professional retreat. Because everyone who mentions it looks the way soldiers Look when they've seen something they haven't finished processing. I've learned to pay attention to that. Mormont looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wall groaned, a sound that had no business coming from ice. Low and resonant, like the complaint of something vast shifting its weight. The torches in the solar flickered without wind. White Walkers, Jon Snow said, before Mormont could measure how much to share. He said it the way you said true things that people were tired of not saying, directly, without ornamentation. The others, they're real. I've seen them. The dead they raise are real. Dragonglass kills them. So does Valyrian steel. Regular weapons don't slow them. The chief looked at Jon. How many? We don't know. Thousands of whites, at minimum. The walkers themselves, fewer. But they don't tire. They don't negotiate. They don't stop. Jon's jaw was set in the particular way of someone, recounting something they'd looked directly at and were still looking at in their memory. And they're moving south. Slowly. But they're moving. The chief processed this with the operational speed of someone who had spent his career receiving terrible intelligence and immediately converting it into tactical framework. An army of undead. 2 known vulnerabilities. Limited supply of both. Valyrian steel was rare by every account he'd heard, and dragonglass was a specific, volcanic material that would need to be sourced and distributed at scale. A commander of apparent intelligence directing them, which meant the walkers weren't simply a natural phenomenon, but a strategic force capable of decision-making. The wall, he said. What keeps them from coming through it? Mormont and Jon exchanged a look, the specific look of people who knew an answer that they weren't sure how to explain. Magic, Mormont said finally. Old magic, built into the ice itself when the wall was raised. The Watch's vows are part of it, we think. The old vows, the original ones. While men hold the wall and mean the words, something in the ice holds with them. And if the wall fails, then everything south of it is everything they can reach, Jon said quietly. And they've had 8,000 years to build an army. They gave him a cell in the Lord Commander's tower, which was the best Castle Black offered, which meant a stone room with a narrow window and a fire that fought the cold to an exhausting draw. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept properly since the slip space rupture, his augmented biology could manage on minimal rest, but the absence of Cortana's voice in his helmet still produced a silence that his nervous system hadn't finished adapting to. She had provided not just tactical analysis, but the specific comfort of another intelligence in the dark. And without her, the dark was simply dark. He ran diagnostics on the Mjolnir's systems instead. Energy shielding at 73%. The sea transit had cost him. And without access to a power source that didn't exist in this universe, recovery would be slow. The armor's servos were operating within acceptable parameters. The MA-5B had 31 rounds. He had his combat knife. He thought about what 31 rounds meant against an army of thousands. In the morning, Jon Snow found him on the wall's top, standing at the parapet and looking north. The wind at that height was a physical force, cutting through the gaps in his armor, with a cold that even his augmented body registered as significant. The land beyond the wall stretched away in gray-white silence. Forest, then open ground, then more forest. The tree-line eventually dissolving into distance and weather. Nothing visible, nothing moving. You can feel it, Jon said, coming to stand beside him. It wasn't a question. I can feel that something's there, the chief said. The way you feel a weapon being aimed at you before you see it. Jon looked at him. You felt that before? Yes. What was it? Before. A pause. The wall groaned beneath them, vast and ancient and cold. Something that wanted everything alive to be dead. That moved in large numbers and didn't stop. He looked north. We called them the flood. The principle is similar. Jon was quiet for a moment, the wind moving through his black cloak. Ghost had somehow made it to the wall's top and sat between them, a white shape against the gray morning. Looking north with the same focused attention both men were giving the horizon. Did you stop them? Jon asked. So far. Jon absorbed this with the gravity of someone who understood. That, so far, was the honest answer. And the only answer that meant anything. The Lord Commander wants to organize a ranging beyond the wall. There are villages we've lost contact with, wildling settlements, but also our own outposts. He wants to know what's happened to them. The chief looked at him. And you're telling me this because? Because I've read the Raven Rob sent. All of it. John met his eyes, or the faceplate, which served the same function. He said you're pointed north. He said you understand what matters. A pause. And in the pause, all of John's careful reserve briefly showed what lived behind it. A young man who had been trying to make the people around him understand something true and urgent for long, enough that he'd developed the exhaustion of a prophet in a world that preferred comfortable lies. I need someone beyond the wall who's seen the end of the world before. The chief looked north again. The horizon was gray and empty and enormous. The kind of emptiness that wasn't absence but concealment. When do we leave? He said. Jon Snow almost smiled. It had the same quality as Rob's smile, old before its time, stripped of the lightness that smiles were supposed to carry, but genuine underneath all of that in a way that the chief's training had taught him to value, more than performed optimism. 3 days, Jon said. The Lord Commander is still deciding. He'll decide, yes, the chief said. Jon looked at him. How do you know? Because he's the kind of commander who sends ravens that he knows won't be answered and keeps sending them anyway. The chief turned from the parapet. Men like that don't stop until they have an answer. They just keep moving toward it. Below them, Castle Black went about its gray morning business. Crows moving across the frost-hardened yard. The smell of wood smoke rising through the cold air. To the north, beyond the tree line and the vast silence, something that had been building for 8,000 years continued to build, patient and cold and entirely without urgency. Because things that could afford to wait always waited. And the dead had all the time that the living did not. They went out through the gate in the wall's base at first light on the 3rd day. 14 black-cloaked brothers of the Night's Watch, Jon Snow at their head, and one figure in green-gray armor that the crows had spent 72 hours developing a complicated relationship with. The relationship had progressed through several distinct phases. The first phase had been open. Suspicion, veterans of the Watch didn't trust. Things they couldn't categorize. And the chief resisted every available category. The second phase had been the training yard demonstration, which had happened on the 2nd day when a brother named Rast, emboldened by wine, and the particular courage of men who'd never been hit by anything that hit back properly, had suggested that the armor was decorative and the man inside it was ordinary. The chief had put Rast on the ground 3 times in 40 seconds without using anything except positioning and leverage, each time more gently than the last in a way that communicated the gentleness as clearly as the speed did. The third phase, following the demonstration, was the specific respectful wariness that professional soldiers extended to other professional soldiers whose professional ceiling they couldn't see the top of. Ser Alliser Thorne, who despised Jon Snow with the consistency of a man who'd made his contempt a personal project, looked at the chief and said nothing, which was the loudest form of acknowledgement available to him. Lord Commander Mormont had given Jon command of the ranging, with the gruff brevity of a man delegating to someone he trusted more than he wanted to admit. The orders were simple in their statement and complex in their implication. Go north, find what had happened to the Fist of the First Men outpost and the wildling villages in the haunted forest's eastern reach. Come back with information. Don't engage unless engaged. The chief had noted the unless engaged caveat with the professional attention it deserved. In his experience, unless engaged in the vicinity of an advancing army of the dead was optimistic planning. The forest beyond the wall was ancient in the specific way that northern forests were ancient, not picturesque, not the managed woodland of southern lords' hunting grounds, but something older and less interested in human presence. The trees were pale-barked and enormous, their branches interlocking overhead into a canopy that turned the gray winter sky into something more distant and less reliable. Sound behaved differently here. Footsteps that should have carried were absorbed. Wind that should have moved branches didn't. The silence wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of attention, the specific quality of quiet that the chief associated with environments that were watching you. His HUD tracked the ranging party's positions, compensating for the canopy's interference with methodical recalibration. Thermal signatures, 14 brothers, all warm, breathing, alive. Ghost ranged ahead of them in the gray distance. A white shape moving between pale trees, visible and then not. The direwolves. Behavior providing better advance. Intelligence than anything the watch had available. Jon Snow moved through the forest with a competence that the chief noted and upgraded his assessment. Accordingly, he was quiet in the specific way of someone trained in it, rather than naturally tentative. Deliberate footfall placement, awareness of sight lines. The unconscious habit of checking his flanks at irregular intervals that spoke of someone who'd learned the hard way that regular intervals became predictable. His Valyrian steel sword, Longclaw. The chief had cataloged it on the first day, noting the dragonglass properties Jon had described. Rode at his hip with the ease of an extension rather than a carried weight. They were 2 hours into the forest when Ghost stopped. The direwolf went from fluid movement to absolute stillness in the span of a single step. White against the pale trees, every line of his body oriented northeast with the focused intensity of an animal whose senses had encountered something that its instincts were processing as existential, rather than merely dangerous. His hackles rose in a slow wave from shoulder to tail. The chief stopped simultaneously, his HUD already shifting to threat assessment mode. Thermal imaging sweeping the northeast quadrant. Nothing warm. He ran the sweep again. The forest northeast of their position contained no thermal signatures. Not reduced, not faint. Not at the edge of detection range. Simply absent. A zone of cold where the ambient temperature of living forest should have been. Contact, he said quietly. And the word carried the specific weight of someone who used it. Precisely and meant it completely. Jon's fist went up. The ranging party stopped. The brothers spreading into the loose defensive formation that watch training produced, functional, improvised. The discipline of men who'd learned in the field rather than a proper military yard. Hands on steel. Breath visible in the cold air. Eyes moving. Ghost didn't move. Didn't growl. Just watched the northeast. With the terrible patience of an animal that understood what was coming and had already accepted it. The first white came through the trees 30 seconds later. The chief had read the descriptions. Jon had spent an evening in the solar providing operational intelligence with the thoroughness of someone who'd survived an encounter and understood that the survival was informational as much as physical. Reanimated dead. Blue eyes. No pain response. No fatigue. Destroyed by fire and dragonglass. He'd processed the intelligence and built a tactical framework around it with the professional competence of someone who'd been processing terrible intelligence and building frameworks around it his entire career. The framework required immediate revision. The descriptions had been accurate. They hadn't conveyed the quality of wrongness, the specific way the dead moved, not the stumbling approximation of life that the word reanimated implied, but something more deliberate and less human, as if whatever was operating the body had learned movement from observation rather than from the inside. The eyes were blue. Yes, blue like ice held up to winter light. Blue that wasn't a color so much as an absence of warmth. The sounds they made weren't moans or cries but something between wind and intention, a noise that seemed to come from the cold itself rather than from anything with a throat. There were 11 of them, emerging from the northeast, in the loose coordinated spread of something that had learned flanking without having been taught it. The watch brothers held for approximately 2 seconds before the professional training fractured against the reality of what they were looking at, and 2 men broke left. Jon's voice cut through the fracture, sharp, commanding, the voice of someone who'd been here before and hadn't broken, calling them back, calling the line, and the line steadied because Jon Snow's voice in a crisis had the specific quality of something solid and moving water. The chief moved forward. He moved at the speed his augmented body and the Mjolnir's servos produced when he chose not to moderate them for the comfort of observers, which was a speed that had made hardened UNSC Marines stop and stare on their first encounter with a Spartan in the field. He crossed the 15 meters between the ranging parties line and the nearest white in the time it took the white to register a new variable in its operational environment, which was not enough time. The combat knife went through the white's neck, and the chief noted immediately that cold steel didn't stop them. The thing kept moving, kept reaching. The severed connection between head and body apparently insufficient. He processed this in the quarter second before impact and adjusted dragonglass Valyrian steel, fire, none of which he had in quantity. What he had was the Mjolnir's strength, amplification, and the physical reality that things without pain responses still operated. Through mechanical systems, he dismantled the nearest white structurally, which was less elegant than dragonglass and more effective than regular steel, and filed the knowledge that his combat knife needed dragonglass supplementation immediately. The MA5 became off his back. He counted rounds the way he'd been counting them since. White Harbor, every one a calculation, a question of what it was worth. He fired 3 times, targeting the walkers he could see at the tree line rather than the whites between them and the ranging party, because the intelligence said the walkers controlled the dead and removing the controller was more efficient than attriting the controlled. The rounds hit. The walkers didn't go down. They weren't dead in the way the whites were dead, and the 7.62mm round staggered them without destroying them, but the stagger was enough to disrupt the coordinated advance, the whites losing momentary coherence as whatever directed them absorbed the interruption. Jon Snow used the gap, Longclaw moving in the precise economical arcs of someone who'd learned that Valyrian steel through a walker's chest worked and wasn't going to waste the knowledge. The first walker shattered like frozen glass, literally, the body crystallizing and fragmenting, and the whites nearest to it collapsed. 28 rounds remaining. The Watch brothers, rallied by Jon's voice and the example of something that moved faster than they'd believed possible, held the line. Torches were the only fire available, and they used them. Whites retreating from the flames, with the specific aversion of something that understood fire as a genuine threat rather than a managed risk. The ranging party lost 2 men, brothers named Corin and Madhar, who had been rangers long enough to know the risks and died in the specific way of men who'd accepted them. When it was over, the forest was quiet again in the way that was worse than the noise had been. They made camp in a defensible position against an exposed rock face. Fire built high and kept high, and the chief sat across from Jon Snow, and they both looked at the same problem from different angles of experience. 28 rounds, the chief said. It wasn't complaint or fear. It was operational information, delivered as such. Jon looked at the fire. Dragonglass kills them cleanly. Valyrian steel does the same. He paused. There's dragonglass on Dragonstone. A mountain of it, according to old records. Where's Dragonstone? South. An island off the coast. Currently, Jon's jaw tightened. In the specific way of someone navigating political geography they found exhausting. Contested. It was a Targaryen seat. Stannis Baratheon held it. Now Daenerys Targaryen has landed in Westeros with 3 dragons and an army. The chief processed the tactical implications. A significant supply of the one material that definitively addressed the threat they'd just engaged, located in the possession of a faction leader whose cooperation would require political navigation in a political environment. He was still mapping dragons he'd been told about, dragons in terms that he'd filed as significant and set aside for direct observation before full assessment. The dragonglass needs to get north, he said. Yes, I've been trying to convince people of that. Jon looked at him across the fire, and in the firelight his face was older than his years in the way that seeing the dead walk made people older. No one south of the wall believes what's up here is real. Not really. They believe it the way you believe in a story. It's there in the words, but it doesn't change what you do in the morning. The chief thought about the flood, about High Charity, about the specific nightmare of trying to convince command that the threat assessment required revising upward when command's entire political structure was built around the assumption that the current threat ceiling was the actual threat ceiling. Someone has to go south, he said. Show them what they're not believing. Someone has to stay at the wall, Jon said quietly. If I leave, Thorne takes command of the ranging. Men die differently under Thorne than under anyone with actual judgment. The chief looked at him steadily. I'll stay. Jon looked up. I'll hold here until you make the political arrangements you need to make. The chief said it with the flatness of someone making a tactical decision rather than a noble gesture. I'm more use at the wall than in a throne room. I don't speak the language of courts. He paused. You do. You're a Stark. Use it. Jon was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked and sent sparks upward into the cold black sky. And beyond the firelight, the forest was dark and patient and full of things that had been dead, too long to remember what living required. The ranging found what it needed to find, John said finally. We know the advance is closer than the watch thought. We know their tactics. He looked north, into the dark. And we know what your weapons do to them, which is more than we knew this morning. 28 rounds, the chief said again. 28 rounds, John agreed. And a mountain of dragonglass in the hands of a dragon. Queen who doesn't know the north needs it yet. The fire burned between them, the only warm thing in a very cold world. And outside its circle the dead continued their patient accumulation in the dark. And the wall held, and the night was longer than it had any right to be. Jon Snow rode south with 3 brothers and a raven's worth of intelligence that he'd spent 2 days composing into language that might penetrate the political insulation that Southern lords wrapped around themselves. Like a second skin, the chief watched him go from the wall's top and then turned back to the north and got to work. What work meant at Castle Black? In the absence of a functioning logistical infrastructure, advanced weaponry, or an AI tactical advisor, was the kind of foundational soldiering that the Spartan II program had built into him before the augmentations and the Mjolnir and the decades of war against enemies. That made Westerosi armies look like training exercises. It meant assessment. It meant preparation. It meant taking the resources available and building something better than what existed with them, because the alternative was waiting for the enemy to define the terms of engagement, and the chief had never once in his career allowed an enemy to define the terms of engagement. If he could prevent it, Lord Commander Mormont watched him work with the expression of a man revising several assumptions. Simultaneously, the first thing the chief did was walk the wall. All 300 miles of it were beyond practical assessment in the time available, but the eastern and western reaches, accessible from Castle Black, he covered in 4 days of methodical survey, moving at a pace that left the Black brothers assigned to accompany him breathing hard and falling behind. Within the first hour, he mapped it the way he mapped every defensive installation, not for its strengths, which were considerable and obvious, but for its failure points, which were less obvious and more important. He found seven locations where the wall's base had developed fractures, invisible from the top, where the ancient ice had shifted over centuries and the settlement had created stress patterns that a concentrated force, or a sufficiently cold winter applied with sufficient patience, could exploit. 3 of them were near the 19 abandoned castles that studded the wall's length like missing teeth, their gates still functional, their wards still present, but their garrison strength reduced to 0 by 8,000 years of watch attrition and southern indifference. He reported this to Mormont in the Solar with a directness that the Lord Commander met with a silence that was less shock than confirmation. We've known about the abandoned castles, Mormont said. They're not just a manning problem, the chief said. They're structural vulnerabilities. If the army of the dead has anything capable of applying focused pressure at those base fractures, cold, weight, any kind of concentrated force, 3 of those positions could fail. Mormont looked at him. You think they know? I think whatever's commanding them has been watching this wall for 8,000 years. I think it knows more about the wall's structural limitations than your maesters do. He paused. I think it's been waiting for the watch to thin out enough that the structural vulnerabilities become exploitable. The Lord Commander was quiet for a long time. The fire in his solar worked against the cold with its usual exhausted determination, and Mormont's raven, the great bird that lived on his shoulder in defiance of every practical consideration, rustled its feathers and regarded the chief with the bright, skeptical intelligence of a creature that had heard a lot of plans announced in this room and watched most of them encounter reality badly. What do you need? Mormont said finally. It was the question of a commander who had stopped asking whether a thing was possible and started asking what it required. Builders at those 3 positions. Whatever stone and timber you have, the fractures need to be packed and braced from the inside. He paused. And dragonglass, as much as can be sourced. Every blade, every spearhead, Every arrowhead your smiths can produce needs to be dragon glass dipped. We have some. Not enough. Mormont's voice carried the specific weariness of someone who had been saying, not enough, about critical supplies for years. Sam Tarley has been studying it. The boy's more useful than he looks. I'll speak to him. Samwell Tarley was round and soft-faced and perpetually apologetic about existing in a way that the Night's Watch had spent a year attempting to weaponize into shame and failed, because underneath, the apology was a mind that worked, with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had decided that if he couldn't be physically brave, he would be comprehensively informed. He had read every account of the White Walkers in the Watch's library. He had documented his own encounters with the precision of a maester's apprentice. He had theories about the wall's magic, about the Walker's origins, about the dragon glass's properties, that he presented to the chief in the library over 3 hours with the barely contained enthusiasm of a scholar who had finally found an audience that wasn't going to fall asleep or mock him. The chief listened to all of it without interrupting. The dragon glass, he said, when Sam finished. You said it's volcanic, formed by dragon fire meeting the earth. Yes, according to the oldest texts, though some maesters argue it's purely geological. If it's formed by dragon fire, the chief said, and there are 3 living dragons currently in Westeros, then the supply isn't limited to existing deposits. Sam stopped. His mouth remained open for a moment in the specific way of someone whose thinking had just accelerated past his ability to speak at its normal pace. You mean, if dragons can be induced to breathe fire onto the right geological substrate, you could manufacture it, the chief said. At scale. Sam sat very still for a moment. Then he grabbed a quill with the urgency of someone who needed to write something down before it escaped. The substrate would need to be specific. Obsidian forms when lava cools rapidly, so the base material would need to be. Work it out, the chief said. Then write it in terms that can be sent to someone with access to dragons. Sam looked up from his parchment. You mean Daenerys Targaryen? Jon is going to her. He needs every argument available. The chief looked at the shelves of scrolls surrounding them, the accumulated knowledge of 8,000 years of watch service, most of it ignored by the people it was meant to protect. What else do you have that's useful and hasn't been used? What Sam had, buried in accounts, that the Citadel had categorized as mythology and filed accordingly, was a reference to the Horn of Joramun, the legendary horn said to bring down the wall, and more pressingly, an account written by a ranger 300 years ago who had observed White Walker behavior during a period of extended cold and noted, with the careful specificity of someone who didn't know what he was documenting, that the walkers appeared to avoid certain geographic features. Specifically, they consistently moved around rather than through areas of dense weirwood growth, even when routing through would have been tactically superior. The chief read this twice. The Weirwood Network, he said. Your Green Seer, Bran Stark. He operates through it. He sees through it, Sam said carefully. Past and present. He might be able to see where they are, where they're avoiding, where they're building. The chief set the account down. Can he communicate through it? Not just observe. Sam's expression shifted into the specific uncertainty of a scholar confronting the boundary between documented knowledge and theoretical possibility. The texts suggest the Green Seer can influence what they see through the trees. Whether that extends to communication, he hesitated. I don't know. No one's tested it because no one's had a Green Seer powerful enough since. He stopped. Bran Stark, the chief said. He's a child, Sam said quietly. Somewhere beyond the wall. With the last Green Seer. The chief absorbed this. A strategic intelligence asset of potentially enormous value, located beyond the wall in territory currently occupied by the advancing enemy, in the body of a child, who was still developing the operational capability of the asset. He'd worked with worse intelligence situations. He'd worked with significantly worse. When Jon reaches Daenerys, the chief said, he needs to know about this. Bran needs to be recovered. The Greenseer network is potentially the only strategic intelligence advantage available against an enemy that can see through dead men's eyes. Sam was writing furiously. How do you know they see through the whites? Because the tactical coordination is too good for an army that can't communicate verbally. They're networked. The Night King is the node. He thought of the flood's grave mind, the distributed intelligence that had turned individual infection into coordinated strategy. The parallel was imperfect, but the principle was identical. Cut the node, the network degrades. But finding the node requires knowing where it is. Which requires a green seer, Sam said. Which requires Bran Stark, the chief said. They looked at each other across the library table. The scrolls and accounts of 8,000 years of managed ignorance piled around them. The wall groaning distantly above. The cold pressing against the windows with the patient insistence of something that understood that. Eventually, everything yielded. The wildlings came to the wall on the 14th day. Not in force, not the massed host that the Watch's nightmare scenarios described, but a group of 30, led by a red-bearded giant of a man named Tormund. Giant Spain, who arrived at the gate in the pre-dawn dark and beat on it with a fist the size of a maul and announced in a voice that carried the specific authority of someone who had never once considered that he might not be listened to, that he needed to speak to whoever was in charge. The brother on gate duty sent for the chief, because the chief had become, in the 16 days since Jon Snow's departure, the de facto decision-making presence at Castle Black in the operational rather than official sense. Mormont commanded. The chief advised. The distinction was maintained with the mutual respect of two professionals who understood that formal authority and practical authority weren't always the same thing, and that pretending otherwise cost lives. The chief opened the gate himself. Tormund looked at him for a long moment. At the armor, the height, the complete absence of anything resembling nervousness in the figure before him, and his expression moved through surprise into the specific appreciation of someone whose respect was genuinely difficult to earn and genuinely worth having. You're the one they're talking about, Tormund said. South of your wall and north of it. The Iron Man. Jon, the chief said. Tormund. The wildling extended a hand, and the chief took it, and the grip that followed was the most straightforward negotiation the chief had conducted since arriving in Westeros. The dead are 2 days north of the Milkwater, Tormund said, when the handshake concluded. Moving south, more than before. Mance sent me ahead. He wants to talk about moving the free folk through your wall before what's coming reaches us. The chief looked at him steadily. All of them, hundreds of thousands, Tormund said. We do not kneel, Iron Man. But we're not stupid either. He looked north, and in the look was everything the free folk knew about what was behind them. Knowledge bought with generations of living in the shadow of it. There's no victory against what's coming up here. There's only south, or there's dead, and then worse than dead. The chief thought about the political implications. The Watch's ranging members, who were still alive, had expressed opinions about the wildlings with the consistency of men who'd spent careers on opposite sides of a wall. Mormont would understand the strategic necessity. Alliser Thorne would not, or would and would oppose it anyway, which amounted to the same thing. He thought about what mattered and what didn't, which was a calculation he'd been making his entire career, and which Westeros hadn't changed, as much as it seemed to think it had. Come inside, he said. Bring your people to the wall. We'll work out the details. Tormund looked at him with the expression of someone who'd expected to spend several days on a negotiation and was recalibrating for a different kind of conversation. Just like that. The dead don't wait for politics, the chief said. Neither do I. Tormund Giant Spain laughed. A laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine. The laugh of a man who'd stopped, expecting the world to make sense, and was genuinely delighted. When it briefly did, he clapped the chief on the shoulder with a force that would have staggered any man not wearing powered armor. And the armor absorbed it, and the chief registered it as contact rather than impact. I think, Tormund said, that you and I are going to get along, Iron Man. Behind them, Castle Black began to process the political reality of what had just been agreed to. And somewhere in the wall's ancient ice, something groaned in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And the cold to the north pressed southward another increment. Patient and absolute and entirely unbothered by the arrangements being made against it. The raven from Castle Black reached Jon Snow at Dragonstone on a gray morning when the sea was the color of old iron, and the 3 dragons were visible as dark shapes against the cloud cover, riding thermals above the castles, towers with the casual ownership of creatures that had decided this rock belonged to them and were correct. Jon had been at Dragonstone for 6 days, which had been 6 days of political navigation, conducted at the pace that Daenerys Targaryen set, which was the pace of someone who held every material advantage in a conversation and wanted the person across the table to understand that before any substantive discussion began. She had received him in the throne room, seated in the carved stone seat that the Targaryens had used for 3 centuries before. Aegon had melted the Iron Throne's predecessor swords together, and she had asked him to bend the knee with the particular certainty of someone who considered the request a formality rather than a negotiation. Jon had declined with the particular certainty of someone who considered it neither. The conversation that followed had been, by every account, that Tyrion Lannister, who stood through it with the expression of a man watching 2 weather systems approach each other, had ever witnessed. The most 2 people had ever talked past each other while meaning every word they said. Then the Raven arrived. Tyrion read it first, because ravens addressed to Jon Snow at Dragonstone were politically significant, and Tyrion had survived this long by being the first person to read politically significant things. He read it in the rookery with the concentrated attention of someone whose mind was already working 3 steps ahead of his eyes, and by the time he'd finished he'd already begun restructuring several assumptions about the strategic situation that he'd been operating on since Daenerys had landed in Westeros. The Raven was from Samwell Tarly, and it contained 3 things. First, the army of the dead had advanced to within 2 days of the Milkwater. Hundreds of thousands of wildlings were moving toward the wall ahead of it. The Watch's population had effectively doubled in a week, and its dragonglass supply was critically insufficient for the force it now needed to arm. Second, a theory presented with Sam's characteristic combination of scholarly hedging and barely contained excitement about the production of dragonglass at scale using dragon fire applied to appropriate geological substrate, with specific notes on the substrate composition available at Dragonstone's volcanic base. Third, a request, polite and precise, and carrying beneath its politeness the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were asking for, an audience between Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen that moved beyond the question of who knelt to whom and addressed the question of whether there would be anyone left to kneel or be knelt to if the army of the dead reached the wall. Before the dragonglass situation was resolved, Tyrion stood in the rookery for a moment with the Raven's message in his hands, and the particular sensation of someone watching a complicated situation simplify in a way that might actually be useful. He went to find Jon. Daenerys held her council in the painted table room. The great stone map of Westeros spread beneath them, the continent rendered in carved relief, with the kind of detail that suggested either extraordinary cartographic skill or dragons providing aerial survey capability. She stood at its edge when Tyrion brought Jon in and placed the Raven's message before her, and she read it with the focused attention that she brought to everything, complete, immediate, the reading of someone who processed information as strategy rather than as narrative. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Jon. "Your man at the wall," she said. "This soldier in the iron armor. He theorized this. Yes. He's not a maester. No. And yet he identified a potential dragonglass production method that 3 generations of Targaryen advisors apparently never considered." She set the parchment down with the precise care of someone placing something valuable. "Tell me about him." Jon told her. He told her about White Harbor and Robb's assessment, about Castle Black and Mormont's measured trust, about the ranging beyond the wall and what the chief had done in the forest when the whites came through the trees, the speed, the tactical adaptation, the precise counting of rounds that communicated a kind of professional discipline that Jon had never encountered in any Westerosi fighter regardless of training or reputation. He told her about the wildlings and Tormund, and the gate opened on practical rather than political grounds, and he watched Daenerys's expression move through several phases of assessment as he spoke. Missandei stood at her queen's right hand and listened with the quiet attention of someone who processed everything and revealed nothing. Grey Worm was at the door, still as architecture. Jorah Mormont, exiled knight. Devoted shadow, his grayscale scarred arm a reminder of what devotion cost in a world without mercy, stood across the table and watched Jon with the guarded suspicion of a man who'd spent years as Daenerys's most singular protector and had developed finely tuned instincts about potential rivals for her strategic attention. He told your brothers, camp, that Tywin Lannister's long-term strategy was built on a foundation that wouldn't hold, Daenerys said. When Jon finished, those were his words. According to Robb's Raven. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sound of dragons, Drogon's particular register, deeper than regal and Viserion. A sound that was less noise than physical pressure, rolled across the castles, towers, and faded. He's right, she said simply. Whatever Cersei builds on Lannister gold and broken oaths, it won't hold. I've known that since I was old enough to understand what my family lost and what. She looked at the painted table, at the carved relief of the continent she'd spent her life intending to reclaim. What I don't know is how much of Westeros survives the proving of it if the dead are already moving south. Tyrion cleared his throat with the diplomatic precision of someone inserting himself into a silence that had lasted long enough. The Dragonglass theory is worth testing regardless of everything else. Dragonstone's volcanic base has been here since before the Targaryens built on it. If the substrate is appropriate, and Sam Tarly's scholarship is generally sound when he's not panicking, then Drogon above the right rock formation could potentially. It would work, Daenerys said, with the certainty of someone who understood Dragonfire not from texts, but from the inside of a direct relationship with it. Drogon's fire is hot enough. The question is whether I'm willing to use my dragon as a manufacturing tool for the benefit of a wall that protects a north that hasn't bent the knee. The question hung in the room with the particular weight of a genuine dilemma, the kind that had a right answer that was politically expensive and a wrong answer that was politically comfortable. Jon looked at her steadily. With respect, he said, in the tone that prefaced things that weren't requests. The dead don't recognize sovereignty. They don't care about the knee. When the wall falls, and it will fall without dragonglass, without preparation, without the kind of strategic coordination that your dragons make possible, they'll come south through a continent that's been spending its men and resources on a political argument about who sits on a chair made of swords. Daenerys looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't offense, closer to recognition. He said something similar, Jon said quietly. The man at the wall. He said the most capable commander in Westeros was pointing his capabilities in exactly the wrong direction. He was talking about Tywin Lannister. A pause. He could have been talking about anyone. The silence that followed was the kind that meant something was being decided. Tyrion found Jon in the castle's eastern gallery afterward, looking out at the sea with the expression of someone who'd said what needed saying and was now waiting to discover whether it had been enough. The gallery's narrow windows framed the water in rectangles of gray light, and the smell of salt and cold stone was sharp and clean after the painted table. Rooms enclosed political air. She's considering it, Tyrion said, settling himself on the window ledge with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime finding comfortable positions in uncomfortable rooms. I know. She's also considering you, which is a different consideration and potentially a complicating one. Tyrion examined his own boots. You have a quality, Jon Snow, that is deeply inconvenient in Daenerys's court. You make people trust you by being trustworthy, which sounds self-evident but is actually quite rare and quite difficult to manage politically. Jon looked at him. Is that a problem? It's a problem if it makes her feel outmaneuvered. Daenerys is not accustomed to being outmaneuvered by people who aren't trying to. Tyrion paused. Your man at the wall. This Jon, he apparently has the same quality. Based on everything you've described, the Lannister agent went north to recruit or eliminate and came back south with a message, and his third set of instructions unopened. Rolfe, Jon said. Rolfe, Tyrion confirmed. I know Rolfe. He's good. The fact that he made the professional judgment to not open the third pouch means the man in the armor produced in him a recalibration that overrode his standing orders. He paused again. That's not charm. That's not manipulation. That's something else. Something that makes people who are prepared to be cynical decide, against their professional training, that cynicism is insufficient for the situation. John looked back at the sea. He's a soldier, the best one I've ever seen. But it's not just that. He was quiet for a moment, finding the words. He's been in wars that make this look, not small. Exactly, but specific. Limited. He's seen what happens when everyone's too busy fighting each other to face what's actually coming. He recognizes the pattern. Another pause. He doesn't want the throne. He doesn't want land or gold or a name. He just wants to stop what's coming. And he's going to keep working toward that with or without anyone's cooperation. Because that's what he is. Tyrion was quiet for a long moment. A dragon passed the window's rectangle of gray sky, regal. The green one, lower than usual, close enough that the wing beats were audible as a rhythmic percussion against the sea wind. That, Tyrion said finally, is either the most dangerous thing in Westeros or the most useful, possibly both simultaneously. He slid off the window ledge. She'll agree to the dragonglass. She'll frame it as strategic rather than charitable, because framing matters to her, and she's not wrong that it does. She'll want something in return, not the knee, not right now, but something that establishes the principle that cooperation runs both directions. What will she ask for? Tyrion considered. Him, he said simply. She'll want to meet the man at the wall. Not by Raven, in person. She'll want to see for herself what makes a Lannister agent decide his instructions aren't worth following. He moved toward the door. Can't say I blame her. I'd like to see it myself. The answer came to John that evening, carried by a Dragonstone servant with the formality of official communication. Daenerys Targaryen would provide dragonglass from Dragonstone's mines, would send ravens to every lord and maester with Sam Tarly's substrate theory, and would dispatch a ship north with initial supply within the fortnight. In exchange, the man called John of the Wall was invited to Dragonstone. Not commanded, invited. The distinction was Tyrion's diplomatic contribution, and it was the right one. John read the message twice and wrote his reply to the chief that night by candlelight. The raven waiting on its perch with the professional impatience of something that had a job to do and would prefer to be doing it. He wrote about the dragonglass. He wrote about the substrate theory and Daenerys's confirmation that it would work. He wrote about the invitation and what it meant and what it would require. Then he added, at the letter's end, in the plain language that the North used when it was being direct, "She is not what I expected. She is also exactly what I expected. I think you'll understand when you meet her. Come south. There are things here that need saying that ravens can't carry." The raven went north into the dark above the Iron Sea, and Jon Snow sat in a Targaryen castle built on volcanic rock that could now, if the theory proved out, produce the one weapon the wall needed in sufficient quantity to matter. And he thought about the chief standing at the wall's top, looking north at something both of them had looked at and understood without needing to compare notes. And he thought that in a world that mostly rewarded cynicism and punished straight dealing, it was strange and specific and worth noting that the straight dealing had somehow worked. At the wall, 300 miles north and 700 feet above the frozen ground, the army of the dead added another day's advance to the accounting that no one south of the wall was keeping carefully enough, and the cold pressed southward, and the weirwood trees stood in their pale rings and watched everything with the red-eyed patience of gods who had stopped intervening and started recording. And somewhere in their network, a boy who was no longer quite a boy saw a soldier in green-gray iron standing at the edge of the world and looking north. And the boy who was the three-eyed raven noted him with the specific attention of something that had seen a great deal of the past and understood that certain presences changed the shape of what came after. He filed the observation in the way that greenseers filed things, not as prediction, because greenseers who confused seeing with knowing made the mistake that cost you everything, but as significance. The Iron Man at the wall was significant. What he would cost was still writing itself in the ice. The ship from Dragonstone arrived at Eastwatch by the Sea, 17 days after Jon's Raven, riding a winter sea that had turned the color of hammered pewter under clouds that carried snow in their bellies, like a threat not yet delivered. It was a Targaryen vessel, black hull, the three-headed dragon's sigil on its sail. The kind of ship that made harbor. Masters in every port between Dragonstone and the Wall revised their political calculations simply by existing in their waters. It carried dragonglass, 40 crates of it, raw and worked both obsidian blades, spearheads, arrowheads, and bulk unworked stone for the Wall's own smiths to shape according to need. Enough to arm 300 men adequately and 1,000 men minimally, which was not sufficient for the force now gathered at the Wall but was considerably more than nothing, and nothing had been the operating supply for long enough that the arrival of the ship produced in the watches, veterans a particular quality of relief that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with professional soldiers finally having the right tool for the job they'd been doing with the wrong ones. The chief oversaw the unloading personally. He moved through the Eastwatch dock with the efficient attention of someone conducting a logistics assessment, which was what he was doing, counting, categorizing, calculating distribution across the Wall's positions against the force assessments he'd been building since the ranging. Tormund walked beside him with the proprietary ease of someone who had decided, in the 2 weeks since the gate had opened, that the Iron Man was his specific ally in the vast political confusion of the current situation and intended to maintain that adjacency through proximity, if nothing else. Dragon Queen sent this, Tormund said, picking up an obsidian blade and turning it in his broad hands with the respect of someone who understood what it did. For free folk. For everyone, the chief said. Distribution is by position, not by origin. The Wall doesn't care where you were born. Tormund looked at him with the expression he'd developed for the chief's particular brand of statement, part appreciation, part the mild bewilderment of someone encountering a consistent ethical framework in an environment where consistent ethical frameworks were evolutionary disadvantages. You sound like Mance when he's trying to convince people to stop killing each other long enough to survive. Is it working? With you it works better. You're taller. Tormund set the blade down. And the armor helps. Free folk respect things that look like they've been through worse than you and kept going. The chief moved to the next crate. The substrate. Production. Has Mormont agreed to send a party south to test the theory? He's agreed to send Sam Tarly, Tormund said, which is Mormont's way of agreeing to test the theory while maintaining reasonable deniability if the Targaryen dragon burns the wrong rocks. Sam's the right choice, the chief said. He understands the chemistry. Tormund made the sound of a man who had heard the word chemistry applied to rocks and fire and had decided to trust the expertise of someone who used words he didn't recognize with the confidence of someone who knew what they meant. And you? Jon's Raven said the Dragon Queen wants you south. I know. You're going. The chief was quiet for a moment, counting dragonglass arrowheads with the methodical precision of someone who did one thing at a time and did it completely. When the Wall is properly supplied and the defensive positions are reinforced. Not before. The dead aren't waiting for your schedule, Iron Man. No, but they're not at the Wall yet. And when they get here, I need the Wall to be ready to hold them long enough for whatever's being arranged in the south to matter. He moved to the next crate. Everything depends on the Wall holding. I'm not leaving until I'm confident it can. Tormund watched him work and said nothing for a moment, which for Tormund was an eloquent form of communication. Then, Mance wants to speak with you. Tonight, if you're willing. About what he knows. About what the free folk know. Tormund's voice had shifted into something less casual. The tone underneath the bluster. That was the actual Tormund, the one that had survived beyond the Wall long enough to understand the enemy better than anyone south of it. We've been living with this for generations, Iron Man. While your watch was sending ravens that went unanswered, the free folk were learning about how they move, about what they avoid, about, he paused, about what the Night King is. The chief stopped counting. He turned and looked at Tormund with the full attention that his faceplate projected as a kind of directed focus. A looking at that was more thorough than ordinary eye contact. Tonight, he said, Mance Rayder was not what the watch's description of him had prepared the chief for. The watch described him as a deserter, a black brother who had abandoned his vows and gone beyond the Wall and somehow, through charisma or cunning or both, united 100 clans of free Folk who had spent generations trying to kill each other into something, approaching a coherent military force. The description was accurate as far as it went and misleading in all the ways that accurate but incomplete descriptions were misleading. What the description didn't convey was the specific intelligence of him, not the intelligence of lords, which was mostly the intelligence of men who'd had power long enough to mistake the results of power for the results of their own capability, but the intelligence of someone who had moved through the world with very little and survived by understanding it accurately. He was perhaps 50, lean in the way of people who had never had enough and had stopped caring about it, with eyes that tracked the chief's armor with the professional assessment of a military commander and the focused curiosity of someone who'd spent a career caring about things that didn't fit the expected shape. They met in Eastwatch's great room. The fire built high enough to make the cold merely present rather than dominant. Tormund at Mance's right and a wildling spear wife named Ygritte, sharp-faced, red-haired, openly contemptuous of any wall real or metaphorical, at his left. Mance looked at the chief for a long moment. Jon Snow described you in his Raven, he said. He said you were the best soldier he'd ever seen and that you'd seen the end of the world before. Something like it, the chief said. What was it like? The question surprised him, not in its content, but in its directness. The absence of political preamble. He'd been in Westeros long enough that he'd started calibrating for the layers of meaning that Westerosi communication operated through, and Mance's directness landed like a return to a register he'd been operating. And before he arrived, organized, the chief said. The enemy was distributed but coordinated. It didn't negotiate. It didn't retreat unless tactically advantageous. It converted what it consumed into more of itself. He paused. The Night King's army is similar in principle, different in details. Mance nodded slowly. Different how? The flood was about consumption, propagation. It wanted to spread. The chief considered the distinction carefully. The Night King, from what I've observed, and what your people describe, isn't trying to spread. He's trying to return. There's a difference in strategic intent. Mance went very still. Return, he said. You think he's done this before? The Long Night was 8,000 years ago. The Free Folk's oldest stories, what do they say about it? Mance and Tormund exchanged a look that contained a full conversation, conducted in the shorthand of people who'd grown up with the same stories. Then Mance said that it wasn't the first time, that there was a night, before the Long Night, that the White Walkers weren't created to fight men. They were created to fight something else, something older, and when that older thing was gone, they turned on their creators because there was nothing left to do except end everything. The chief processed this. The children of the forest created them to fight the first men, Mance said. That's what the songs say. But the oldest songs, the ones the children themselves apparently left in the weirwood carvings before they disappeared, say the walkers, weren't made for men. Men were a second purpose, an accident of remaining existence. The chief thought about the Forerunners, about the Halo array built to starve the flood by destroying its food supply, which was every sentient species in the galaxy, about the specific tragedy of weapons, built for existential threats becoming existential threats themselves when the original threat was neutralized. The parallel was close enough to be uncomfortable. The Night King's original enemy, he said. Whatever the children built him to fight. Do the songs say what it was? Something from before? Ygritte said, speaking for the first time, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone repeating something learned by rote, something that came from the sea, or from beneath it, or from a place that isn't north or south, or any direction men have names for. The songs aren't specific, because the people who were specific about it didn't survive to finish the song. Tormund said quietly. The fire cracked and sent sparks upward. Outside, the wall groaned with the particular register that the chief had catalogued in the 17 days since Jon's departure. Lower tonight than yesterday. Lower yesterday than the day before. A slow deepening that is audio processing tracked as structural stress increasing incrementally. The cold was pressing, not dramatically, just persistently, with the patience of something that understood that persistence was more reliable than force. Mance, the chief said, what do your people know about the Night King specifically? Not the army. Him. Mance was quiet for a moment. The fire threw his shadow large against the stone wall behind him, shifting with the flames. He was a man once. The oldest stories say a great man, a commander, a warrior, something the first men and the children both respected before the transformation. They made him what he is with a shard of dragon glass through the heart. And whatever he was before, that version didn't survive the making. Can he be unmade? Everything made can be unmade, Mance said. That's not a comforting answer because the question is how. And the how is what? 8,000 years of free folk. Wisdom hasn't been able to establish. He looked at the chief steadily. What we do know is this. When the Night King falls, the dead he's raised fall with him. Every white. Simultaneously. Because we've seen it. Not with the Night King himself, but with the Walker lieutenants. Kill the Walker, the whites it raised drop. Scale that up to the top of the command structure. Decapitation strike, the chief said. If you want to use those words, Mance said. Yes. The chief sat with this for a moment. Decapitation strikes required intelligence on the target's location, access to the target, and the capability to eliminate the target once accessed. The first was potentially available through Bran Stark's Greenseer network. The second was the operational challenge that everything else in the current strategic situation existed to address. The third, 27 rounds remaining. A combat knife, armor at 68% shield, integrity and declining slowly without maintenance capability. Valyrian steel worked. Dragonglass worked. He had neither in sufficient quantity for a direct engagement with the Night King. He thought about Dragonstone, about Daenerys and her dragons, about what a dragon represented not just as a military force multiplier, but as a potential delivery mechanism for the one thing that definitively addressed the Night King's command structure. Dragonfire applied, at the right moment to the right target. I need to go south, he said. It wasn't a conclusion he'd been resisting. He'd been waiting for the intelligence that made it the correct operational priority rather than political compliance. And Mance had just provided it. The wall, Tormund asked, is as ready as it can be made with current resources. The chief stood. The dragonglass from Dragonstone covers the defensive positions. The free folk know how to fight the dead better than the Watch does. Mance. Your people's knowledge needs to be integrated into the Watch's defensive doctrine before the army arrives. Work with Mormont. He's practical enough to use information regardless of its source. Mance looked at him. You trust Mormont. He keeps sending ravens that don't get answered and sending men out to gather intelligence regardless. That's the behavior of someone who's committed to the truth of the situation, rather than the comfort of the alternatives. He picked up his rifle. Yes, I trust him. And the Dragon Queen? Tormund asked. The chief was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Jon had written. She is not what I expected. She is also exactly what I expected, and thought that he'd encountered commanders like that before. Commanders whose capability was genuine and whose judgment was contingent on what they were shown, and whose showing required someone willing to be direct with them at personal risk. She controls the one weapon that can end this, he said. Whether she's willing to point it in the right direction depends on whether someone can make her understand what the right direction is. He moved toward the door. That's a conversation that needs to happen in person. She'll want you to kneel, Tormund said. She'll want a lot of things, the chief said. We'll figure out what's actually necessary. He left Eastwatch's great room and walked back through the cold, toward Castle Black under a sky that had cleared briefly to show stars that were the same stars as every other sky he'd ever stood under, and meant nothing different by it. The wall rose to his left, vast and ancient and groaning its slow structural complaint into the night. And he looked up at it and calculated, as he calculated everything, constantly, with the persistent methodology of someone whose survival had always depended on accurate assessment. How long it would hold. Long enough, he thought, if everything else moved at the pace it needed to move. And then, because he'd been in enough wars to know that, long enough was always a conditional estimate and never a guarantee. He added the caveat that his training had taught him always to add. Probably. Dragonstone rose from the sea like something the ocean had tried to swallow and failed. The chief saw it first from the ship's prow in the gray pre-dawn, the castle's towers emerging from morning mist with the particular quality of structures that had been built by people who understood that architecture was a form of statement and had wanted their statement to be unambiguous. Black stone, dragon-shaped buttresses, towers that tapered into points like the teeth of something vast and patient. The volcanic rock beneath it steamed faintly at the waterline where the island's geothermal activity met the cold sea, giving the whole approach the quality of arriving at something that was still being made. Above it, three shapes moved in the clouds. The chief tracked them with his HUD's targeting system out of professional habit rather than intent. Drogon, the largest, black against the gray sky, wingspan casting a shadow that crossed the ship's deck as he banked south. Regal, green gold, lower, tighter circles. Viserion, cream and gold, furthest out, ranging over the open water to the east. His targeting system outlined them in acquisition brackets, and he manually disengaged the overlay. Because targeting the assets of the person he was about to negotiate with was operationally counterproductive regardless of reflex. They were extraordinary. He'd read the descriptions. Jon had spoken about them with the specific reverence of someone who'd stood close enough to feel the heat, displacement of their passing. Sam's Ravens had included academic notes on wingspan and estimated firepower. None of it had conveyed the quality of wrongness, not wrongness in the white sense, not the absence of life, but the opposite, an excess of something. Life amplified past the scale that felt safe. Intelligence burning. Behind those eyes that was old in the way that the Weirwood network was old. Old in the way the walls groaning was old. Old in the way that made the political arguments of the Five Kings feel like arguments about furniture arrangements. In a house that was on fire, Drogon noticed the ship. He came lower in a long banking curve that was geometrically perfect in the way that things without self-consciousness were perfect. No showing off, no performance. Just the most efficient path from where he was to where he was interested in going. The ship's crew, hardened Targaryen sailors who'd worked these waters since Daenerys had landed, went through a practiced sequence of not panicking that spoke of extensive experience in not panicking. The chief stood at the prow and watched Drogon come and did not move. The dragon pulled up 40 feet above the deck, the wing beats hitting the ship like a physical concussive wave. Spray and wind and the smell of something hot and sulfurous that had no business being present over cold northern water. He hung there for a moment, an impossible amount of mass suspended by physics that the chief's training told him should not have been sufficient but apparently was, and looked at the figure in green-gray armor on the prow with the focused intelligence of something deciding whether this was interesting or threatening. The chief looked back. After a moment, Drogon banked away and resumed altitude, rejoining his brothers in the cloud cover. The ship's crew exhaled collectively. "First test," said the Targaryen captain, from somewhere behind the chief, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone who'd expected something worse and was recalibrating. Accordingly, he does that with everyone who comes for the first time. "Did I pass?" The chief said. A pause. "You didn't run or draw a weapon," the captain said. "That's passing where Drogon's concerned." Daenerys received him in the painted table room, which Jon had described, and which was exactly as described. The Great Stone Map, the carved relief of Westeros in miniature, the particular power dynamic of being invited to look at a continent from above while the person who considered it her stood at its edge. She was smaller than the command she projected, which was true of every effective commander the chief had encountered. Authority was never about physical scale, and the people who understood that were always more dangerous than the ones who didn't. Tyrion Lannister stood at her right hand with the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this specific meeting and was managing the anticipation professionally. Jon Snow stood at her left, and when the chief entered, Jon gave him the fractional nod of someone transmitting, "This is manageable. Proceed carefully, she's listening." Missandei introduced them with the formal precision of someone who took the rituals of introduction seriously, because the rituals communicated things that the words didn't. Grey Worm was at the door. Jorah Mormont stood against the far wall with the expression of a man cataloging a potential threat and finding the cataloging uncomfortable. Daenerys looked at the chief with the complete attention she brought to everything. And the chief looked back with the complete attention he brought to everything. And the room held this mutual assessment for long enough to become its own statement. John tells me, she said, without preamble, that you've seen something like what's coming from the north before. Something with the same principle, the chief said. Different details. Did you stop it? Yes. How? He considered how to answer this in terms that would translate to Westerosi strategic framework. By understanding what it actually wanted rather than what it appeared to want. By finding the command structure and removing it. By using the right weapon in the right place at the right moment. He paused. And by accepting that stopping it would cost more than anyone wanted to pay. Daenerys absorbed this. What did it cost? More than I can account for in a single conversation. He said it without self-pity or drama, which was the only register available to him for that particular truth. The principle is the same here. The Night King commands the army. Remove the Night King, the army collapses. Everything else, the dragonglass, the wall, the political arrangements, is preparation for the moment when someone gets close enough to him to end it. Someone, Tyrion said, with the careful emphasis of someone noting an interesting word choice. The decapitation strike requires access and the right weapon, the chief said. Valyrian steel or dragonglass. I have neither in sufficient quantity for direct engagement with the Night King at his current position, which is why I'm here. Daenerys looked at the painted table, at the carved wall in its north, at the carved King's Landing in its south, at the enormous space between them that was currently being contested by 5 kings, and soon to be crossed by an army of the dead. You want my dragons, she said. I want your dragons pointed north, he said. There's a difference. She looked up. Explain it. Pointed at King's Landing, your dragons end a political argument. Pointed north, they end an existential threat. The political argument will still be here after the long night. The people who'd be having it won't be. The room was very quiet. Outside, the sound of the sea against Dragonstone's volcanic base was constant and rhythmic and indifferent, the ocean making its case for scale against the small warm arguments of the creatures clustered above it. You don't want the throne, Daenerys said. It wasn't a question. No. You don't want land or title or gold. No. What do you want? He said what he'd said to Robb Stark's table in White Harbor. What he'd said to Mormont in the Castle Black Solar. What he'd said to Mance in Eastwatch's Great Room. The same thing. Because it was true and truth didn't require variation. To stop what's coming. To give the living the best possible chance. And then to find my way back to where I came from. Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Jon, and Jon looked back with the expression of someone who had already had this conversation with himself and reached the conclusion she was approaching. The substrate theory, she said. Sam Tarly's letter. I want to test it today. They went to the island's eastern shore, where the volcanic base was, exposed in a long shelf of dark rock that steamed faintly at the Titterline. Sam's letter had been specific about substrate composition. The obsidian-forming conditions required rapid cooling of volcanic material, which meant the existing rock face was less useful than the thermally active zones where geothermal heat was still present beneath a thinner surface layer. The chief had read the letter 4 times on the voyage south and had identified, from Sam's geological description, 3 locations on the island's eastern face that fit the theoretical requirements. He'd shared the analysis with Tyrion during the morning briefing, and Tyrion had shared it with Daenerys. And Daenerys had looked at the map, coordinates with the expression of someone who was going to find out whether this worked and was prepared for it not to. Drogon came when she called him, which was less like calling an animal and more like completing a circuit, a sound from her that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a command, but was clearly both. And the great black dragon descended from the cloud cover and landed on the volcanic shelf with the ground shuddering. Impact of several tons of something that didn't apologize for its mass. Up close, Drogon was a recalibration. The chief's HUD ran size estimates. Automatically, body length approximately 60 feet, wingspan approximately 120, estimated weight in the multiple ton range, and then his visual processing overrode the estimates with the simple fact of presence, which was that Drogon was not a creature that could be meaningfully understood through measurements any more than the wall could be understood through measurements. He was a fact. A living, breathing, intelligent fact with scales the color of a deep space and eyes that were orange gold and burning with something. That wasn't fire, but was adjacent to it. He looked at the chief. The chief looked at him. Drogon's nostrils flared. The sulfurous heat smell intensified. A wave of it that the chief's armor registered as elevated thermal input and his augmented biology registered as extraordinary, and something moved. Through the dragon's eyes that was not assessment, in the human sense, but was its equivalent. Recognition of something that had stood in front of things that should have killed it and hadn't been killed. Daenerys watched them look at each other with an expression that Tyrion would later describe as surprised and then something more complicated than surprised. He doesn't do that, she said quietly to Jon, who was standing beside her. Do what? Jon said. Consider, she said. He either accepts or rejects. He's considering. Drogon turned away from the chief and toward the rock face at Daenerys' soft direction, the not quite word, not quite command, and opened his mouth and breathed. And the fire that came out was black at its core and orange at its edges and hot enough that the chief's armor registered critical thermal input warnings at 40 feet, and he stepped back to 30 and the warnings reduced to elevated, and he held position there. The rock face glowed, then melted. Then the surface layer flowed and bubbled, and the geothermal layer beneath it vented upward in a column of superheated gas. And where the dragon fire met the flowing volcanic material, and the cold sea air hit it from the eastern shore, the surface crystallized in a fast dark wave, obsidian, raw, and rough-edged, and formed in the span of 30 seconds. A shelf of it 6 feet wide and 2 inches deep, cooling to the blue-black of dragon glass in the salt air. Sam would have made a noise at this point. The chief simply noted it, calculated the production rate, extrapolated against the wall's defensive requirements, and said, "We need to do this for 6 hours a day until we have enough to arm every person who's going to stand between the dead and the living." Daenerys looked at the new dragon glass, still smoking faintly at its edges. Then she looked at the chief. 6 hours per day? For as long as it takes. That's not a small request. No, he said. It isn't. She was quiet for a moment. The sea wind moved. Her silver hair and the dragons circled overhead, and dragonstone steamed beneath them all. Jon Snow trusts you completely, she said. That's not a small thing. Jon Snow trusts carefully. I know. Tyrion finds you interesting, which is his version of trust. She paused. Drogon considered you, which is unprecedented in my experience of him. I can't account for the dragon, the chief said. No, she said. Neither can I entirely. She looked north, across the Iron Sea, toward the wall that was invisible over the horizon but present in every conversation being had in every castle in Westeros, whether the people having it acknowledged it or not. 6 hours a day, she said. And when we go north, and we will go north, I've decided that. Cersei and her arrangements notwithstanding, Drogon goes where he's most useful, not where I most want him. It was the hardest thing she'd said in the chief's presence, and he recognized it as such, the specific difficulty of a commander accepting that the asset they were most attached to needed to be deployed by operational necessity, rather than personal preference. Understood, he said. She nodded once. The nod of someone who had made a decision and was finished making it. Then she turned back to the rock face and directed Drogon to the next position. And the fire came again, and the obsidian formed. And the chief began calculating distribution, logistics with the methodical precision of someone who had found the resource and now needed to build the system that would make it matter. That evening, Tyrion found him on Dragonstone's eastern battlements, looking north across water that had gone black with the fallen dark, the distant wall invisible, but present in the way that very large things were present even when you couldn't see them. She's going to ask you to fight beside her, Tyrion said, settling against the battlement with his wine, not as a subject, as something else. She doesn't have a word for it yet, which is itself significant. Daenerys normally has words for every relationship in her orbit. She can ask, the chief said. You'll say yes, if the tactical situation requires it. He looked north. The Night King's army is going to reach the wall before we have enough dragonglass to arm everyone adequately. That's a mathematical reality that the production schedule doesn't resolve. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. So the plan isn't to hold the wall indefinitely. The plan is to hold the wall long enough for the decapitation strike to be possible. He turned to look at Tyrion, which requires knowing where the Night King is, which requires Bran Stark. Tyrion absorbed this. Bran is beyond the wall. Yes. Getting him back requires going beyond the wall. Yes. Which is, Tyrion stopped. You're going back north. After the Dragonglass supply is established and the production system is running without requiring my direct oversight. The chief looked back at the water. Bran Stark is the strategic intelligence asset that makes everything else possible. Without knowing where the Night King is, the decapitation strike is a theory. With that knowledge, it becomes a plan. And going beyond the wall to retrieve a Greenseer boy from whatever ancient tree god situation he's currently embedded in is. Tyrion searched for the appropriate word. Complicated. Yes. Dangerous. Yes. Possibly fatal. Possibly. Tyrion looked at him with the expression he reserved for things that were simultaneously admirable and exhausting. You know, most people who come to Dragonstone do so to gain something. Power, gold, alliance, survival. You've come to arrange a production schedule and plan a rescue mission beyond the wall. I came to arrange what's necessary, the chief said. And what do you get from it? The chief was quiet for a moment. The northern sea moved in the dark below them, cold and constant. The same thing I always get, he said. The work done. The line held. Tyrion considered this with the philosophical attention of a man who had spent his entire life watching people pursue power and had never quite stopped being surprised when someone didn't. He drank his wine. He looked north into the dark alongside the armored figure at the battlements. And for a moment the political complexity of Westeros fell away. And there was simply the dark and the cold and the thing building in it, and two very different people looking at the same problem from different angles of a very similar experience. You know, Tyrion said finally, for a man who says he wants to go home, you're doing a remarkable amount of work on someone else's war. It stopped being someone else's war, the chief said. Somewhere around the first ranging. Below them, Dragonstone's volcanic base steamed into the dark water, and the new Dragonglass on the eastern shelf cooled toward the hardness it would need when the time came. And somewhere in the vast network of weirwood roots beneath the frozen ground north of the wall, a boy who was the memory of the world turned his white eyes toward the south and saw a ship that had come from Dragonstone riding north through dark water. And he saw what was in it and what it intended, and he filed the significance of it in the way that Greenseers filed things that mattered, not as comfort, because Greenseers had learned that comfort was a luxury that accurate seeing didn't permit, but as the particular quality of attention reserved for moments when the shape of what came after was being decided by the choices of the present. The Iron Man was going north again. The dead were still coming south. The distance between those two facts was where everything would be settled, and the settling was going to cost something that no one had yet finished adding up. The wall came apart at Eastwatch. Not all at once. The wall didn't fail dramatically, didn't shatter in the single catastrophic moment that songs would later insist upon for narrative tidiness. It failed the way the chief had predicted it would fail when he'd mapped the structural fracture points in those first weeks at Castle Black, incrementally, under sustained pressure applied, with the patience of something that had been building toward this moment for 8,000 years and was not interested in rushing it now that the moment had arrived. The cold came first. Not winter cold. The North knew winter cold, had named itself around winter cold, had built its entire cultural identity on the premise that it understood cold better than any people south of the neck. This was different. This was cold as intention, cold as command, cold that dropped the temperature at Eastwatch's eastern tower 40 degrees in the span of an hour and frosted the interior walls and turned the breath of every man on the battlements into clouds that didn't disperse but hung, suspended, as if the air itself had decided to stop moving out of deference to what was coming. The chief felt it through the Mjolnir's thermal sensors. Before any man on the wall felt it through his skin. He was on the eastern approach road, 3 miles from Eastwatch. riding north with Tormund and 6 wildling scouts who knew the terrain beyond the wall better than any Watch Ranger alive. They were 4 days back from Dragonstone, the Dragonglass production system running at pace under Targaryen supervision. Bran's location established through a method that had required 3 days of Sam Tarly's correspondence with the Citadel and 1 crucial raven from Mira Reed. Bran was moving. Whoever had him was bringing him south. The Green Seer was in transit, which meant the intelligence asset was days away rather than weeks. And the operational window for the decapitation strike was narrowing toward the point where it either happened or it didn't. Then the thermal sensors spiked. "Stop," he said. The wildling scouts stopped, with the immediate responsiveness of people who had learned to listen to the Iron Man's assessments without requiring explanation. Tormund pulled his horse alongside and looked at the chief with the focused attention of someone reading a situation from its edges. "What is it?" Tormund said. "Temperature drop. Eastwatch direction. 40 degrees in." His sensors updated. 53 minutes. Tormund looked east. The horizon was gray and unremarkable and offered nothing visible. Then he looked at the chief with the expression of a man whose instincts had just confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. "That's not weather," he said. "No," the chief said. "It's not." He keyed the Raven signal, the system he'd established with Mormont. Crude by every standard he'd ever operated under, but functional. A series of colored smoke signals that could communicate 6 specific operational states across the wall's visible length, and sent the sequence that meant contact imminent. Eastern position, all hands. Then he rode for Eastwatch at the Mjolnir's full assisted speed, which left Tormund and the scouts receding behind him with the philosophical acceptance of people who had developed a working understanding of what the armor could do. The Viserion problem became apparent from 2 miles out. He saw the blue flame first, not orange, not the orange gold, of living dragon fire that Drogon had breathed onto the volcanic rock of Dragonstone's eastern shelf, but blue-white. The color of the white's eyes amplified to the scale of a dragon's breath. It hit the wall's eastern face in a sustained column and the ancient ice. 700 feet of it, 8,000 years of accumulated winter, did not melt in the way that normal dragon fire would have melted normal ice. It crystallized differently. It changed. The magic that had lived in the walls. Construction for 8,000 years and had held the dead at bay through the accumulated weight of oaths and ancient intention met the Night King's corrupted Dragonfire, and the meeting was not a victory for either force, but a compromise, a fracture, a slow structural failure propagating upward through the ice from the base fracture point the chief had mapped in his first week at Castle Black. The eastern tower was already leaning. He arrived at Eastwatch's yard as the first section of wall came down. It came down slowly, which was worse than if it had come quickly, the ancient ice separating from itself in a sequence of cracks that each sounded like the end of something. The 700-foot section above the eastern fracture tilting, holding, tilting further, and then dropping in a cascade that sent ice fragments the size of houses across the ground for 300 yards and opened a gap in the wall 40 feet wide, through which the cold air from the north moved immediately and with the specific urgency of something that had been waiting for exactly this. Through the gap, the army of the dead began to pour. The chief had 26 rounds remaining. He'd used 2 on the ranging and 1 more in a white encounter on the road north from Eastwatch the previous week. 26 rounds, a combat knife, armor at 59% shield integrity, and the knowledge that the tactical situation had just moved from preparation into engagement, faster than the preparation had been designed to accommodate. He assessed the gap in 6 seconds, 40 feet wide, the dead coming through in the coordinated spread heat, observed in the ranging, not the mindless flood that the Watch's accounts described, but organized, flanking, the distributed intelligence of the Night King's network directing traffic through the breach with the efficiency of something that had been planning this specific moment for a very long time. Whites in the thousands, the advance units already pushing through and spreading east and west along the wall's base, seeking to secure the breach's flanks before the defense could organize. The Watch and the Wildlings were at the battlements and in the yard, a combined force of roughly 900 people, armed with dragon glass-tipped weapons in numbers that were sufficient for the force they'd expected to face in a controlled, defensive scenario and insufficient for an army of the dead pouring through a 40-foot gap in the world's largest wall. Mormont was on the eastern battlement, his voice cutting through the noise, with the carrying authority of a man who had commanded in chaos before and understood that authority in chaos was less about orders and more about presence. The simple fact of a calm voice existing in a disordered environment gave the people around it something to organize around. Tormund arrived 60 seconds after the chief, his wildlings streaming in behind him, and moved immediately to the breach's western flank without being directed because Tormund understood the tactical problem as quickly as anyone the chief had ever worked with. The chief went to the breach itself, not to hold it. One person couldn't hold a 40-foot gap against thousands of dead, regardless of armor and augmentation. And the chief's tactical training had a very clear relationship with the difference between courage and waste. He went to the breach to buy the 60 seconds it would take Mormont's forces to establish the defensive line 20 yards back from the gap, the position he'd spent 3 weeks preparing. Dragonglass-tipped stakes, fire trenches filled with oil and pitch, overlapping fields of fire. For the Watch's crossbowmen with dragonglass-tipped bolts, he fired 6 rounds. Not at Whites. Whites were controllable with dragonglass, and the defensive line would handle them. He fired at the Walker lieutenants he could identify at the gap's edges, the commanders whose presence was maintaining the advance's coordination. Each round hit. Each hit staggered. 2 Walkers shattered outright. The 7.62 millimeters rounds weren't dragonglass, but they hit with sufficient kinetic force at close range to disrupt the crystalline structure that the Walkers' bodies apparently depended on. The Whites, those two had been directing lost coherence immediately, stumbling into each other, disrupting the advance's western flank for 45 seconds. 45 seconds was enough. Mormont's line formed. The fire trenches lit. The crossbows began their methodical work, dragonglass bolts punching through Whites with the clean efficiency of the right tool correctly applied, and the advance through the breach slowed from a flood to a contest. 20 rounds remaining. Viserion came over the wall at the battle's 20-minute mark. The dead dragon was enormous and wrong in every dimension. The cream and gold coloring had gone to gray-white and ice blue, the eyes burning the same cold fire as every White the chief had encountered, amplified to the scale of something that had no business being reanimated. He flew with the same physical capability as a living dragon and none of the living dragons' independent judgment. The Night King's command, operating him as directly as it operated every White in the army below, which meant Viserion was precise and relentless, and entirely without the self-preservation instinct that made living creatures manageable threats. The blue fire hit the defensive line's eastern anchor, and the oil trench went wrong, not out, but accelerated. The Night King's corrupted flame, interacting with the pitch in ways that turned a controlled fire barrier into an uncontrolled one, and 4 Watch brothers died in the reconfiguration before Mormont's voice redirected the eastern flank west. The chief tracked Viserion through his HUD. 14 rounds. A dead dragon with no pain response, no self-preservation instinct, and scales that had been reinforced by whatever the Night King's reanimation process did to the bodies it raised. The 7.62 millimeters rounds would hit. They would not bring Viserion down. He knew this with the mathematical certainty of someone who had run the calculation continuously since the breach opened and arrived at the same answer every time. He needed Drogon. He sent the signal, the second system he'd established before leaving Dragonstone, the Targaryen coordination protocol that Daenerys had accepted with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who understood that real-time tactical communication was a genuine military advantage even when the communication method was smoke and colored glass. 3 red flares from the eastern battlement. The sequence that meant breach, dragon, now. Daenerys was 12 miles south, off the coast with Rhaegal and Drogon, holding position at the intercept point they'd identified together over the painted table as the location from which she could reach the wall, fastest if the breach happened at Eastwatch. She had agreed to the intercept position after 2 days of discussion. That had been less argument than calibration. Two people with very different relationships to authority working out what shared command actually required. From each of them, she had agreed. Because the chief's tactical logic was sound, and because Jon Snow had said, quietly, that the man at the wall didn't make tactical recommendations for political reasons, and Daenerys had filed that observation in the place she filed things that were true and uncomfortable and necessary. The flares went up. Drogon arrived in 4 minutes, which was faster than the chief's calculation had predicted and meant. Daenerys had been flying closer than the agreed position, which meant she'd made the independent, tactical judgment that 12 miles was too far for the response time the situation was likely to require. He revised his assessment of her upward accordingly. Drogon hit Viserion from above and west in a collision that shook the ground below and sent both dragons tumbling north in a tangle of wings and fire, living fire versus dead fire, orange gold versus blue-white, the air between them crackling with the specific wrongness of two magical forces with opposing orientations meeting at full expression. The sound was beyond any scale that Westerosi warfare normally operated at, and for 10 seconds, every person at the breach stopped fighting and looked up because the thing happening in the sky above them was too large to ignore regardless of the tactical situation. Then the chief's voice, amplified through the Mjolnir's external speakers to a volume that carried across the battle's noise without effort, called the line back to its work. And the line went back to its work because the voice had the quality of something that didn't stop and didn't ask you to panic and didn't offer false comfort, and that quality, in a crisis, was the thing that held lines together when everything else was pulling them apart. The Night King appeared at the breach at the battle's 41st minute. He came on foot, which the chief had not anticipated and which his tactical training flagged immediately as either an error in the chief's threat modeling or a statement, and the Night King, who had 8,000 years of strategic patience and the command intelligence that directed an army of thousands, did not make errors. He came as a statement. He came through his own breach in his own wall with the specific authority of something that owned the ground it walked on and was demonstrating that ownership to everything present. He was tall, pale blue skin, ancient features, the crown of transformed bone that the Watch's oldest accounts described. His eyes were the cold fire of every white amplified to its source, not the reflected command, but the command itself, burning and absolute and entirely without the quality that living eyes had, the quality of something behind them that was still becoming. He looked across the defensive line and he found the chief. The chief looked back. In the pause that followed, 3 seconds, 4, the battle continuing on both flanks. While the center held this specific stillness, the chief ran the tactical assessment with the dispassion of someone who had been trained to assess exactly these situations and had trained through every version of the outcome that dispassion produced. 20 rounds, armor at 41% shield integrity, a combat knife, a defensive line holding but not advancing, the breach still open, Viserion and Drogon fighting above in an engagement whose outcome was not yet determined. The Dragonglass stockpile at Eastwatch's armory, sufficient. The Watch and Wildling force, holding the Night King's army through the breach, but not yet past the defensive line's depth. The decapitation strike was now, or it was later, and later meant more dead, and a defensive line that was currently holding at the cost of brothers and free folk who were dying in the methodical way that people died when they were fighting the right enemy with insufficient force and doing it anyway. Because the alternative was not fighting. He moved forward, not running. The Mjolnir didn't telegraph intent through speed, and speed against the Night King was less useful than angle and approach, because the Night King had the tactical intelligence of 8,000 years and would read a direct frontal approach with the ease of something that had seen every human attack pattern ever conceived. The chief moved at the pace that looked like he was walking and covered ground at the rate that made the distinction academic. He fired twice. not at the Night King, at the Walker lieutenants flanking him, because the flanks were the threat multiplier and reducing. The flanks bought the approach 2 seconds of reduced interference. 18 rounds. The Night King raised his hand, and the cold intensified to the physical, a wall of it, the ambient temperature dropping fast enough that the chief's armor registered emergency thermal warnings across every sensor simultaneously, and his shield integrity dropped 8% in 4 seconds from the sustained thermal assault alone. He kept moving. The Night King looked at him with the ancient, burning cold of his eyes and did something that nothing in the chief's career had ever done. Not the Covenant, not the Flood, not the prophets or the grave mind or the decades of war against enemies that exceeded human scale in every direction. He tilted his head, not in curiosity, in recognition, the specific recognition of something encountering an unknown element and identifying it as significant. The chief filed this and kept moving. 12 feet out, the Night King raised his other hand, and 3 whites that had been engaged on the eastern flank turned from that engagement and moved to intercept with the coordinated speed of directly commanded assets, not the distributed intelligence of the networked army, but the direct control that the Night King applied to his personal guard. The chief took 2 of them with the combat knife, the dragon glass-edged blade he'd had fitted in Eastwatch's forge 3 weeks ago, 2 strikes in one continuous motion that left the whites crystallizing and collapsing before the third reached him. The third hit his shields at 31% integrity, and the impact registered as significant, and he used the momentum of the collision to close the last 4 feet. The combat knife met the Night King's chest. The Night King caught his wrist. The grip was absolute, not stronger than the Mjolnir's servos. Nothing was stronger than the Mjolnir's servos at full extension, but cold in a way that bypassed the armor's thermal protection and hit the chief's augmented body directly. The Night King's cold as a weapon distinct from ambient temperature, targeted and intentional and extraordinary in its effect. The shield integrity dropped to 0. The chief fired twice through the Night King's grip. Point blank, the muzzle of his pistol, the M6D, the sidearm he'd kept for exactly this kind of close engagement, pressed against the ancient pale blue chest. And the rounds hit, and the Night King staggered back 1 step, the grip releasing, the cold receding by 3 degrees that felt like 30 in the aftermath. 16 rounds. The Night King looked at him from 1 step's distance, with the ancient cold burning in his eyes, and the chief looked back. Shields gone, armor integrity compromised at multiple points. Combat knife in his left hand, pistol in his right, standing between the Night King and the defensive line that was holding the breach behind him. Then Arya Stark hit the Night King from behind. She came from nowhere in the specific way that Arya Stark came from nowhere. Not the supernatural nowhere of the Faceless Men's full practice, but the practical nowhere of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible in environments that were actively looking for her, who had crossed the battle in the chaos of the engagements flanks, while every tactical eye, including the Night King's, was focused on the armored figure moving toward him from the front. The dragonglass dagger went in below the ribcage with the upward angle that a slight girl used when her opponent was considerably taller, and she'd thought carefully about geometry. The Night King looked down, looked at the chief, looked at Arya, shattered. It was the same crystallization the chief had observed in the Walker lieutenants, the same rapid propagation from the dragonglass wound outward through the body structure, but at the Night King's scale the shatter was total and immediate, and accompanied by the wave effect that Mance had described. Every white in the breach, every white beyond it, every white in the vast army of the dead that had been pouring through the gap for 41 minutes, collapsed simultaneously, the command network severing at its root and taking every node with it. The silence was extraordinary, not the silence of the North, which was the silence of something present and watching, the silence of absence, of a thing that had been building for 8,000 years, suddenly not building anymore. Arya Stark stood in the ruins of the Night King and breathed, and the chief stood beside her and breathed, and the wall's remaining sections groaned, with the specific quality of something that had been under sustained pressure and was now incrementally releasing it. Not today, Arya said quietly. The chief looked at the collapsed army around them, at the dead that were simply dead now, without the blue fire animating them, at the gap in the wall, through which the cold still moved, but moved now as ordinary cold. The cold of the north without intention behind it. No, he said. Not today. Above them, the sounds of the aerial engagement shifted, Viserion, without the Night King's command, dropped from the fight and fell. A dead dragon, genuinely dead this time, hitting the ground beyond the breach with an impact that shook the earth for a mile. Drogon circled once above the wall and then descended to the ground near Daenerys, who had come north with Rhaegal and landed at the breach's edge at the battle's 43rd minute with the Dothraki and Unsullied advancing behind her. She walked through the collapsed dead to where the chief and Arya stood, and she looked at the Night King's remains, and she looked at Arya Stark, and she looked at the chief. You held the line, she said. We held the line, the chief said. The correction was automatic and genuine and included every person who had stood at the breach and died doing it. The Watch brothers and the Free Folk and the Dothraki and Unsullied who had ridden north when the flares went up. The long chain of decisions and preparations that had made the 41 minutes survivable. Daenerys looked at him for a moment, with the expression she'd been developing over the weeks of their working relationship, not the assessment expression she brought to political situations, but something less guarded. The expression of someone who had stopped calculating and was simply present with what was true. What do you need? She said. It was Mormont's question, asked weeks ago in the Castle Black Solar. And hearing it again, the chief recognized it as the question that competent commanders asked when they decided that the situation required meeting rather than managing. Dragonglass, he said. Distribution to every holdfast and castle between the Wall and King's Landing. Whatever walkers survive the Night King's fall need to be accounted for. The Whites are down, but the walkers are independent. They won't have collapsed with the network. How many? Unknown. Probably few. But few walkers. With their independent intelligence. And no command structure to answer to is a different kind of problem than an army. He looked north, through the gap in the wall, at the vast silent terrain beyond it. And the wall needs to be repaired. The eastern section. Before the next winter. There won't be another Night King, Daenerys said. There won't be another Night King, he agreed. But there are other things. There are always other things. He looked at the gap. The wall was built because people who had seen what was possible decided to build something that acknowledged the possibility. Leaving it broken is deciding the possibility is over. Daenerys looked at the gap for a long moment. Then, I'll have Drogon help with the reconstruction. Sam Tarly has notes on the magical reinforcement protocols, the chief said. The original construction involved the children of the forest. Bran Stark's connection to the Greenseer network may allow him to replicate some of what was originally built in. Bran Stark is here, Jon said, appearing at Daenerys's shoulder with the quality of someone who had been present for the last several minutes and had been waiting for the right moment to deliver news. Mira Reed brought him through the western gate an hour ago. Jon paused, finding the word different, but present, and he says he has things to tell us. About what happened, about what's still possible. The chief looked at Jon. Jon looked back with the expression that had been developing over the months since White Harbor, the expression of someone who had learned through the specific curriculum of the worst circumstances available that the straight dealing worked and was worth doing even in a world that mostly punished it. Then we start there, the chief said. Around them, the living began the work that always followed battles, the accounting, the caring for the wounded, the naming of the dead, the specific difficult labor of continuing after the thing that had threatened continuation was gone. The wall's remaining section stood against the gray northern sky, broken at the east and holding everywhere else, ancient and vast and groaning. Its slow complaint into the cold air. That was now just cold. Tormund found the chief as the work began, clapping him on the pauldron, with the force that the armor absorbed, and the chief registered as contact and affection in equal measure. Well, Tormund said, looking at the collapsed army, the broken wall, the living who were still living. That was something. Yes, the chief said. What happens now? The chief looked south, toward the continent that was still contested, still divided, still running the political arguments that the long night had interrupted, and would resume the moment the immediate crisis was processed into past tense. Toward King's Landing, where Cersei Lannister sat, the Iron Throne, with the specific tenacity of someone who had outlasted every force that had moved against her by being willing to do what those forces weren't, and who would now have to reckon with the fact that the war she'd been ignoring had ended and the armies that had fought it were still present and needed somewhere to put their attention. Toward Dragonstone, where the Dragonglass production system would keep running because the Walker problem wasn't fully resolved, and the world didn't simplify itself just because the largest threat had been addressed. Toward Bran Stark, who had seen everything and would now have to decide what to say about it, and to whom and in what order. North first, the chief said. Always north first. Close what's open. Secure what's broken. Account for what's left. He looked at the gap in the wall. Then south. Tormund nodded with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had stopped expecting the world to simplify and had made his peace with the next problem always being present. And after south, the chief was quiet for a moment. The cold moved through the gap in the wall from the north, ordinary winter cold now. The cold that the north knew and had built its identity around. And the gray sky was gray in the ordinary way of winter skies, and the silence beyond the wall was the silence of absence rather than presence. He thought about Cortana, about the Pelican, about the slip space rupture that had brought him here, and the physics that had produced it, and the question of whether physics that opened once could be understood well enough to open again in a controlled direction. Sam Tarly had been corresponding with the Citadel about the Forerunner beacon residue that the Mjolnir's sensors had detected at the rupture site. The correspondence was careful and scholarly, and proceeding at the pace of institutions that had survived for thousands of years by not moving quickly, and the chief had accepted this pace with the patience of someone who understood that the work got done or it didn't, and rushing the Citadel's maesters was not a variable that affected the outcome. After south, he said, depends on what Sam finds. Tormund looked at him with the expression of someone who had understood less than half of that sentence and was fine with it. And if Sam finds nothing? The chief looked at the broken wall, at the work ahead of it, at the living doing the living's work in the cold morning of what came after. Then I have more work to do here, he said. And that's enough. The Battle of Eastwatch entered the histories under a dozen different names, depending on who was writing them. The Night's Watch called it the Last Ranging. The Free Folk called it the night that ended, though the night had been gray and cold rather than dark, the way the worst things often were. The maesters at the Citadel recorded it with careful scholarly neutrality and spent considerable ink on the anomalous armored figure whose presence at every critical juncture they noted but could not account for within established Westerosi frameworks. The small folk, who cared nothing for scholarly frameworks, called him the Iron Crow, a crow who hadn't taken the black, who answered to no lord and bent no knee and stood at the breach when the dead came through. The songs they made about him were imprecise and contradictory and probably wrong in most of their details, which was how the best songs always went. What was certain, the wall was being rebuilt. Bran Stark's voice moved through the Weirwood network, reinforcing the ancient wards with the patience of someone who had all of history available to him and was using it carefully. Daenerys had turned her dragons north before she turned them south, which changed what Westeros thought was possible. And in a maester's correspondence in the Citadel's deepest archive, a letter addressed to no one in particular described an anomalous energy signature detected at a site in the Shivering Sea, a signature that matched, in its mathematical proportions, the remnants of something that had once opened and might, with sufficient understanding, open again. John 1:17 was shown the letter on a gray morning at Castle Black by a round-faced scholar who presented it with the excitement of someone who had found an answer and the kindness of someone who understood what the answer meant. The chief read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it away and went back to work. Winter still came, but the living had learned, at considerable cost, how to meet it. That would have to be enough. For now,